Part 1 of Chapter 5 of Uncle Joe's Stories by Edward Knatchbull-HUGESSON. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Allyson Hester. Part 1 of Chapter 5. Ophelia. Next to an insane giant, there is nothing more terrible than a mad pygmy. It was therefore a dreadful event for all people concerned when the king of the pygmies went out of his senses. The disease came on gradually, and was not immediately discovered. His Majesty had never been of a very lively disposition, and the court was therefore not much amazed when he withdrew from the public gaze, little by little, until he was very rarely visible beyond the precincts of the palace, and was understood to be deep in his studies. Those, however, who had the privilege of being immediately about his royal person were well aware that his Majesty was seriously indisposed. At first the symptoms were only those of profound melancholy. He declined his food repeatedly, refused to open his letters, buried his face constantly in his hands, and went to bed when the dinner bell rang. This was unpleasant, as the royal household were forbidden by the laws of that kingdom to have any dinner except at the same time with the king, and as pygmies are invariably blessed with good appetites, much inconvenience would have been caused but for the recognized fact that nobody ever obeyed the laws unless it happened to suit him to do so. In this manner the difficulty was got over, and the illness of the king might have been concealed from his people if no other symptoms had appeared. But from silent melancholy the unhappy monarch shortly passed to the stage of frantic violence. He threw anything he could lay his hands on at the head of any individual who came near him, used the most fearful language, and gave the most extraordinary orders. These at first were evaded or received in silence, in the hope they might be forgotten as soon as spoken. But when the king insisted upon it that the prime minister should be cut in pieces, the lord chamberlain fed upon rabbit skins and oil, and the chief justice baked without further delay, these functionaries severally and together came to the conclusion that the thing could go no further. The laws of Pygmyland were clear and well known. Upon the death or incapacity through illness of the reigning sovereign, his eldest son always ascended the throne as a matter of course, and, failing sons, his nearest relative succeeded to the sceptre. Unfortunately, however, the king of the pygmies had neither son nor relative of any kind, which arose principally from the fact of his having destroyed his father's and mother's families, owing to those jealous fears which often disturb and distract the minds of tyrants, and from the additional circumstance that he had never seen fit to marry. Thus King Pugpaws was the last of his race, and although he was undoubtedly no longer fit to govern the nation, the question as to his successor was, as will readily be imagined, one of very great doubt and difficulty. The three great officers of state, that is to say, the prime minister, the lord chamberlain, and the chief justice, who rejoiced in the ancient and high-sounding names of Binks, Chinks, and Pigspud, laid their heads together several times before they could by any means agree as to what should be done. Each of them would have been willing to undertake the government himself, and each thought he was the best person to whom it could possibly be entrusted. But the other two held quite a different opinion. Chinks and Pigspud well knew that Binks, eaten up with gout and rheumatism, was not a person whom the pygmy nation would ever accept for their king. Pigspud and Binks were perfectly well aware that Chinks had a wife and family whose combined arrogance and extravagance would certainly ruin the kingdom if he were placed upon the throne, and Binks and Chinks were thoroughly acquainted with the evil life which caused the public to regard Pigspud as one of the worst men, though the best of judges. So, since it was evident that none of the three could be safely elevated to the throne, it became necessary to look about for somebody else. The names of all the great people about the court were duly considered, but although there were several who would have been very willing to undertake the business, there were objections to all. One was too old, another too idle, a third too tyrannous a disposition, and a fourth too stupid for the place. So for a time it really seemed as if it would be impossible to find a king, and that they must either put up with their mad sovereign or go without one altogether. Neither of these results, however, would have been satisfactory either to the court or to the nation, and it was therefore with joy rather than anger that the three great officers of the state received the news that a relation of the royal family had been discovered to exist, in whom a successor to the unhappy madman might be found. This was the only son of the king's uncle, who, having been cruelly treated by his father in early youth, had left Pygmyland in disgust, and had been currently reported to have died shortly afterwards. This, however, had not been the case. Prince Famcram had done nothing of the kind, and had never intended to leave the world unless compelled to do so, by circumstances beyond his control. He had embarked aboard a vessel, which was bound on a long voyage, and had possibly cherished the hope that his absence from home would soften his father's heart and procure for him kinder treatment upon his return. It is impossible to say whether this might or might not have been the result, inasmuch as the opportunity of proving the same never occurred. It was not long after the prince's flight that his cousin, the king, took it into his royal head to destroy all his blood relations, among whom his uncle, the prince's father, naturally perished. When therefore the young man next received news of his family, he learned that there were none of them left alive, except the royal destroyer of the rest. This news, strange as it may appear, afforded him no inducement to return to the land of his nativity, for dear as one's country should be to every well-regulated mind, life is not unfrequently dearer still, and Prince Famcram was unable to discover any sufficient reason why he should imperil the one by visiting the other. He stayed away, therefore, and lived as best he could in foreign lands, until the insanity of his cousin, King Pugpoz, had been officially proclaimed and publicly made known. Then, having no longer any fear for his life, he returned to Pygmyland without delay, and at once advanced his claim to the sovereignty. There were, as is usual in such cases, some persons who pretended to doubt his identity, and declared he was only an impostor. The evidence in his favour was, however, too strong for these disloyal and worthless persons. The prince had all the characteristics of a noble family. His hair was of a bright, staring red. He squinted frightfully with both eyes, had one leg considerably shorter than the other, and was gifted with a protuberance between his shoulders, which was not far removed from a hump. He had, moreover, the family dislike to cold water, a strong propensity to drink spirits, and a temper which, of itself, was enough to stamp him as one of the royal line which he claimed to represent. Add to this that his language was by no means well chosen or polite, that his disposition was cowardly and cruel, and that he cared for nobody in the world but himself, and you have a fair and accurate picture of the prince upon whose head the crown of the unhappy Pugpoz was about to descend. It may be readily inferred that the prospects of Pygmyland did not seem to have been much brightened by the change. Indeed, between a mad king and a bad king, the difference appeared so small to some people that they were unable to see what the country had gained by the substitution of one for the other. Nevertheless, the unswerving devotion to royalty which has always distinguished pygmies did not fail that mighty nation upon the present occasion. Famcram was welcomed by the voice of the people, and those who doubted his identity were got rid of as soon as possible. His first act, indeed, put beyond doubt the righteous nature of his claim. He directed Pugpoz to be immediately strangled, partly to avenge the death of his relatives, and partly because he thought it a safer and more satisfactory arrangement that any chance of his returning to a sane condition of mind should at once be destroyed. Being now undeniably the only legitimate claimant to the throne of his ancestors, he determined to enjoy himself as much as he possibly could. There were considerable treasures in the royal coffers, which had been amassed by Pugpoz and his predecessors, and with which King Famcram might have purchased as much enjoyment as would have served him for a prolonged lifetime. Being, however, of opinion that to be merry at other people's expense is by far the best plan if you can possibly manage it, he gave out that he expected the principal grandees of the country to entertain him at banquets, balls, croquet and lawn tennis parties, and in order to encourage them in their endeavours to outdo each other in pleasing their beloved monarch, he declared his intention of marrying the daughter of the nobleman who, at the end of the next 6 months, should have best succeeded in that laudable attempt. The influence of such a promise was of course prodigious. To be the father-in-law of the king was an object well worth the attainment, and every great man throughout the length and breadth of the country felt his heart beat high at the royal announcement. Some indeed there were, who, having no daughters, were not particularly impressed by the circumstance, and spoke of the whole affair as a whim of the monarch, to which slight importance was to be attached. Others, who, having seen the manner in which the late king had disposed of his relations, doubted the advantage of becoming too closely connected with the royal family, proposed to themselves to take no particular pains to surpass their neighbours in the attempt to please King Famcram. But, to tell the truth, the great majority of those who heard the royal determination, and who happened to have marriageable daughters, received the news with great delight, and determined to spare no exertion which might secure such a son-in-law for themselves. Conspicuous among these would-be competitors for the prize were the 3 great officials, Binks, Chinks, and Pigspud. Each was married, and none was daughterless. To all 3, therefore, the field was open, and hope beat high in their official breasts. Since they first heard of the arrival and claims of Famcram, the 3 statesmen had unitedly and steadily welcomed and supported him. They had therefore some claims upon the royal gratitude, and hitherto their interests had been so far identical that they had been able to work together. Now, however, the interests of each were opposed to those of the other 2. According to the laws of Pygmyland, the king could only marry 1 wife, and therefore his selection of the daughter of either of the 3 ministers would at once throw the others in the shade, and place the father of the bride in a position far superior to that of the other 2. This circumstance, as might have been expected, caused some slight interruption of the harmony which had hitherto prevailed between these 3 illustrious personages. At first, however, the only intention of each of them was honestly to outdo the other 2 in the splendour of the reception which he should afford his sovereign. To Binks as Prime Minister fell the first opportunity, and King Famcram gave him due notice that he should shortly honour him with a visit to his villa, which was situated near the Pygmy metropolis. Now it so chanced that Binks was a widower, principally in the consequence of his wife having died, and of his having thought it unnecessary to seek another. He had, however, 2 fair daughters, gems of their sex, and bright ornaments of the court of Pygmydom. Euphemia was above the height ordinarily allotted to her race, and could not have been less than 3 feet and a half high. Her nose was aquiline, her cheeks flushed with the red blossom of her youth, her eyes dark and piercing, her figure all that could be desired, and her voice clear as a lover's lute in a still evening. Araminta, less tall than her sister, had a delicacy of complexion unrivalled in Pygmyland. Her blue eyes were modestly cast down if you accosted her. She spoke in tones soft and low, like the south wind whispering in the mulberry trees, and whilst her sister took your heart by storm, she stole it into unawares, and made you captive before you knew you were in danger. Such is the description of the 2 daughters of the noble house of Binks, as given by a Pygmy writer of eminence at that time, and such were the charms against which King Famcram had to contend at the beginning of the campaign. The Prime Minister had intended that his entertainment should take the shape of a banquet, but the ladies insisted upon a ball, and a ball it was consequently to be. Immense preparations were made for days, nay, for weeks beforehand. The villa was gorgeously decorated, the ballroom tastefully arranged, and the choicest music was provided, and no pains spared to ensure the desired success. At last the day arrived, and the hearts of Binks and his daughters beat high with expectation. The villa was beautifully placed upon the slope of a mountain, at the foot of which a broad river wound through flowery meads and fertile fields, enriching and beautifying both in its onward course. The grounds of the villa, stretching along the banks of the river, were beautiful to a degree seldom seen out of Pygmyland, and never had they appeared to greater advantage than on the present occasion. Gay flags streamed from staffs placed in the most conspicuous positions, as well as from many of the tallest of the trees which abounded in those magnificent gardens. Sounds of lively music were wafted upon the soft summer breeze to the entranced ear of the listener, and every heart was filled with rejoicing and merriment. King Famcram was received at the entrance by a crowd of well-dressed courtiers and obsequious attendants, who awaited his coming with all that exuberant loyalty which is preeminently characteristic of the true pygmy. He appeared somewhat late, as was in those days always deemed becoming in royal personages, and his coming was announced by the enthusiastic cheers of the dense crowds which thronged the approaches to the garden gates. Seated in the hereditary coach of the pygmy monarchs, drawn by 8 cream-coloured guinea pigs, and clad in rich garments of various hue, Famcram drew near the habitation of the honoured Binks. In his hand he held the ancient sceptre of his race, which was nothing less than the petrified skull of an early occupant of the pygmy throne, who had by his will left his head to be devoted to this purpose, and directed that it should be riveted in gold settings upon his favourite walking stick, and further ornamented by such gifts as his faithful subjects might choose to bestow out of respect for the memory of their deceased lord. As his successors, each upon his accession to the throne, invited new gifts to the sceptre as a test of continuous loyalty and devotion to the throne. The head of the dead king had practically brought greater wealth to his family than it had ever done during his lifetime, and although an additional precious stone or two was set in the skull after each recurrence of gifts, the greater portion of these were, it was more than supposed, converted into cash by the various monarchs who received them, and appropriated to their own royal purposes. This valuable weapon King Famcram waved in his hand as he neared his Prime Minister's dwelling, and looked round upon his people with a proud and kingly gaze as he passed along. Binks, as was but natural, met his royal master at the gate, and prepared to escort him up the avenue to the door of the villa, across a profusion of flowers with which the way thereto was covered. Famcram alighted from his carriage, and suffered his host to conduct him through the great gates, and to go bowing and scraping before him up the avenue. He followed, squinting around him in a friendly manner, and graciously expressing his approval of the beauty of the place. But as soon as he had reached the stone steps which led up to the villa door, the latter was thrown open, and, one on each side of the doorway, stood the 2 daughters of the ancient house of Binks, clad in gorgeous attire, and each holding in her hand a magnificent bouquet of the choicest flowers, which it was their intention to humbly offer to their august sovereign, and which they lost not a moment in presenting. Scarcely, however, had Famcram set eyes upon the sisters and perceived their intention, than he positively snorted with disgust, and starting hastily backwards, during which process he planted his heel firmly upon the gouty toe of his Prime Minister, he turned round fiercely upon the latter, and accused him of having intended to poison him. "Wretch!" he cried, "there is poison in those flowers which your daughters, if such they be, offer to me, and doubtless it has not been placed there without the knowledge and consent of their vile parent. I know it but too well. Make no excuses, for they will all be useless. The nose of a pygmy of the royal race is never mistaken. My great-great-grandfather was poisoned by a subtle venom concealed in a carnation, and in the similar flowers which are conspicuous in each of the bouquets I see before me, I detect the fate you had in store for your sovereign. But you shall bitterly rue it. Seize him, guard." The unhappy Binks, overcome with astonishment and terror, in vain raised his voice to protest that nothing was further from his thoughts than to perpetrate such a terrible crime as that which the king suspected, and that, too, against a prince whose cause he had espoused from the first, and in whose favour his whole hopes were placed. He vowed that his daughters were certainly as innocent as he was, and implored that the bouquets might be carefully examined in order to prove that no poisonous substance had been placed therein. It was all to no purpose. Famcram only flew into a still more violent passion. "No poison in the flowers!" he cried. "The villain doubts his king's nose and his king's words. Off with him, guards, at once, and let his daughters be taken too." At these words, Euphemia and Araminta, who had listened with awe-struck countenances and beating hearts to the extraordinary remarks of the king, gave utterance to wild shrieks, and fell fainting upon the doorway, from which they were speedily dragged by the king's orders, and hurried away with their unhappy father to the dungeons of the palace. Having thus got rid of his host and hostess, Famcram allowed himself to calm down gradually, and, entering the ballroom, permitted those to dance who wished to do so, whilst he himself proceeded without delay to the supper room, and made himself as comfortable as possible. He then directed all the plates and valuables of the luckless Binks to be packed up and taken to the palace, and, having placed a guard over the villa, which he declared should in future be a royal residence, he departed with the satisfactory feeling of having made a good night's work of it. When news of what had been done reached Chinks, the soul of the Lord Chamberlain was greatly exercised thereat. He did not for a moment imagine that Binks or his daughters had been guilty of the crime imputed to them by their royal master, but in the acts of the latter he discerned a steady determination to possess himself of the wealth of his richest subjects, and to reign more absolutely and despotically than his predecessors. How to escape the fate of Binks was a problem by no means of easy solution. He was blessed with 3 daughters, Aspalia, Bettina, and Paraphernalia, so much alike that they could not be known apart, and so beautiful that nobody could see them without immediately becoming devoted to them. In these damsels Chinks placed his hopes, and could not but believe that the king, however hardly he had dealt with his prime minister, would not be insensible to the charms of his Lord Chamberlain's daughters. Still, he received with some fear and trembling the notice which Famcram shortly sent him, that he would visit him at his country house in the following week. As the selection of a ball had not turned out well in the case of Binks, the Chinks family resolved upon another sort of entertainment, and, at a vast expense, hired a celebrated conjurer to perform before the sovereign and his court. The preparations were great, the company numerous, the weather all that could be desired, and the monarch, with his attendant courtiers, arrived in due time at the house, and was ushered into the spacious hall, where everything had been arranged for his reception. The 3 daughters of the house, dressed exactly alike, were there to receive him, but not a flower was to be seen about any of them, so that the fatal error of the prime minister's children might be avoided. They were dressed simply, and reverently knelt before the king as they raised their voices to sing, in tones as true as they were sweet, an ode which their father had himself composed in honour of his sovereign's visit. Scarcely, however, had they finished the first verse, when the little tyrant roared out at the top of his voice, "They sing out of tune! They sing out of tune. A royal ear is never deceived. He has made them do it because he knows I cannot bear a false note. Seize him, guards! Away with him and his shabbily dressed girls!" Chinks stepped forward to explain matters in his most courtly fashion, when the king brought down his sceptre upon his head with such a thwack that you might have heard it at the other end of the hall, and, though his wig, which was particularly large, partially saved him, he dropped senseless upon the floor, whilst his daughters broke into shrieks of despair, which were really out of tune, and were painful indeed to hear. Famcram stopped his ears and howled loudly for his guard, and before many minutes had passed, the Lord Chamberlain and his daughters were on their way to the same dungeons whither Binks and his girls had preceded them, and the king was occupied in selecting everything in the house which appeared to be most costly and beautiful, and directing that it should be forthwith sent to his palace. Thus within a few days were 2 out of the 3 great functionaries of the kingdom dismissed, disgraced, and left in great peril of their lives, whilst the king had added considerably to his wealth, and had got rid of 2 people, whom he had either suspected or pretended to suspect of being likely to be troublesome. These events made a profound impression upon the mind of Pigspud, and all the more so when notice came from the king that he should pay him a visit in the following week. The Lord Chief Justice was a wily and astute man. Although his life had not been reputable, the peccadilloes of great lawyers in that country were so usual as to be regarded by the public with a lenient eye, and, late in life, his appearance had become so eminently respectable, that a stranger would certainly have taken him for a dean rather than for a judge, for a deep divine rather than for a learned lawyer. He had but one daughter, tall, majestic of stature, for she was nearly 4 feet high, and with dark hair and eyes so bright that they seemed to look right through you. Ophelia Pigspud was a most remarkable woman. She was well read, so well read that people said she could have passed an examination with credit in almost any subject she had been pleased to try. Reading, in fact, was no effort to her, and her powers of memory were extraordinarily great. It was even said that she knew more of law than many lawyers of the day, whilst no one could deny her skill in modern languages, and her astonishing proficiency in general literature. As the venerable Chief Justice gazed upon his child, who was indeed the pride of his heart, he could not but feel uneasy at the prospect of her being sent to join the families of Binks and Chinks in the dungeons of the royal palace. "Never," he exclaimed, "shall such a fate befall my peerless Ophelia." And having given utterance to this exalted sentiment, he thought for 3 days and 3 nights how to carry it out, and utterly failed to discover anything at all likely to succeed. Then he bethought himself of consulting the young lady herself, of whose opinion he thought so highly that it is curious he had not done so before. She smiled calmly when he laid the case before her, reminding her at the same time that there wanted but 3 more days to the time fixed by the king for his visit. "Be not alarmed, my beloved father," said she, "but be assured that the blood of a true Pigspud will not be untrue to itself in the coming trial. Besides, the education which your kind care has provided for me has taught me means of escape from even worse dangers than those which can proceed from our tyrannical sovereign. Doubt not that it will turn out well." With such reassuring words did the daughter of the Chief Justice restore courage to the heart of her parent, and he began to look forward with less fear to the banquet at which it had been arranged that he should entertain his royal master. It was to be served in the large banqueting hall of his town house, and great preparations were set on foot for several days before that appointed for the festive gathering. But instead of busying herself about the matter, Ophelia treated it as if it was one wholly indifferent to her, and refused to be troubled about it in any way whatever. It was in vain that the domestics, who were accustomed to take all orders from her, besought her to give various directions upon several questions which arose. She declined altogether, deputing everything to Mrs. Brushamop, the housekeeper, and telling old Winnilees, the butler, not to come near her on pain of instant dismissal. Her own rooms were in a wing of the house which stretched down to the banks of the river already mentioned, and from a private door she could get down upon the banks without coming in sight of the windows of the principal apartments. But before I relate that which happened to the fair Ophelia at this eventful time, it is but right to inquire what had become of the unhappy families who had already felt the weight of the tyrant Famcram's displeasure. Binks with his two, and Chinks with his 3 daughters, had been cast into the dungeons of the royal palace, and the wife of Chinks, having been added to the party, greatly increased the misery of all by her continual upbraidings of her husband and his friend as the cause of the misfortune which had befallen their 2 families, which were all the more hard to bear, because they were totally unreasonable and without foundation. The dungeons were small, hot, and unsavoury, and the prisoners suffered greatly, especially as the food supplied to them was scanty in quantity and wretched in quality. The young ladies endeavoured to pass away the time in composing epitaphs upon their parents and themselves, which after all did but little towards raising their spirits, being, as such things not uncommonly are, of a somewhat melancholy character. Euphemia and Araminta, however, were so proud of one of their compositions that it would be a pity that it should be lost to the world. Here lies the minister, great Binks. No more he for his country thinks, no more he eats, no more he drinks, but conquered by misfortune, sinks. The daughters of the Lord Chamberlain were scarcely equal to such a poetic effort as the above, but, determined not to be behindhand, presented their parent with the following stanza: "Look through these bars with the eye of lynx, and see the Chamberlain, Lord Chinks. He scarce can breathe, and feebly winks, quite done to death by prison stinks." In this manner did the innocent maidens endeavour to lighten the hours of captivity which passed over their heads, and when, upon the 2nd week of their imprisonment, they were moved into larger and more airy apartments, hope at once revived within their drooping bosoms. It must, however, be confessed, that in the midst of their distress, both Binks and Chinks contemplated with silent but real satisfaction the probably speedy advent of Pigspud, to join them in their prison, and share their sorrows. This event they both regarded as quite certain to occur, and without having any particular ill feelings toward the Chief Justice, the 3 had been too long in the position of rivals to make either too sorry for any misfortune that befell the third, especially if it had previously fallen upon themselves. Leaving these worthies to their expectations, we will now endeavour to discover what was passing at the abode of Pigspud. It was the evening but one before the projected banquet. The shades of the evening were fast closing in around the city, and the mists of the river were beginning to rise like vapoury spirits from the water, when the private door of Ophelia's wing was stealthily and quietly opened, and a figure emerged, clothed from head to foot in a cloak of dark grey. Slowly but surely, as one who knew the road well, the figure passed along the low terrace walk that led down to the bank of the river, and stood at the brink, silently for a few moments, and then began to murmur words in a low tone. A listener, however attentive, could scarcely have made out the meaning of that which Ophelia, for it was none other than the daughter of the house of Pigspud, was reciting, for the language in which she spoke was strange, and her tone somewhat indistinct. "Marley, quarley, patchel, farley, mansto, mackin, furlis, sparley, mondo, pondo, sitcho, pinto, framsigallin, hanon tinto." Such were the mystic words which issued from the lips of the maiden, nor was it long before a response was given. A low murmuring sound proceeded from the river, and out of the rushes which fringed the bank there presently arose a form of strange and weird appearance. It was that of an old, very old woman, with a red cloak wrapped around her, and an umbrella in her hand, and a poke bonnet upon the top of her head. She was small, though not much below the ordinary height of a pygmy, but the most remarkable thing about her was the extreme keenness of her eye, which seemed to pierce you through and through when she fixed it upon you. Slowly she rose from among the rushes, and scrambled, somehow or other, up the bank, until she stood opposite to the maiden who had summoned her. As soon as she had accomplished this feat, she struck her umbrella upon the ground, and remarked in a somewhat masculine tone of voice: "What is it, Ophelia, and what do you fear, that you've called your affectionate godmother here? Has your pa been unkind, since no ma you have got, or a lover appeared when you'd rather he not? Are you ill or unhappy, or is't for a freak, that your godmother's presence you suddenly seek?" Ophelia listened with respectful attention whilst the old woman uttered these words, and then replied in a low, sweet voice: "Did I not deem the crisis grave, I had not called thee from thy wave; and if in doing so I err, forgive me, gracious godmother. My father knows thee not, great dame; my mother told me, all the same, thou wast my godmother, and so I love thee in my weal and woe. Overcome by cruel destiny, poor Binks and Chinks in dungeons lie, and our bad king, a grievous sin, hath likewise put their daughters in. Dear godmother, 'twere sad, you know, my father should to prison go, but sadder still, you'll hardly fail to see that I should go to gaol. Yet it is the time but 2 days hence, when Famcram comes on some pretence, he'll surely send us both to prison, and make our valuables his'n. Dear godmother, pray leave thy wave, thy loving goddaughter to save, or tell me how, by thy kind aid, the tyrant's power I may evade." Whilst Ophelia was speaking, the old woman kept tapping her umbrella upon the ground in visible wrath, and a frown appearing upon her face, which was otherwise not particularly beautiful, did not greatly improve her personal appearance. As soon as the maiden ceased, she lost not a moment in making her reply: "I'm ready, my darling, to do your behest, for tyrants like Famcram I greatly detest. And if your good father was not such a dolt, from the land of despot he'd speedily bolt. For Binks and for Chinks I have nothing to say, and they're probably just as well out of the way. But as to their daughters, I'm really inclined to think that the king has gone out of his mind. And in your case, I'll teach him as well as I can. A woman has rights just as much as a man, and he's vastly mistaken, poor wretch, if he thinks a godchild of mine is the same as Miss Binks. Now listen to me. When King Famcram comes here, betray not the slightest suspicion of fear, but enter quite calmly the banqueting room, arrayed in your commonest morning costume. He'll show irritation, and rage beyond doubt. You know he could scarcely be royal without. But never mind that, though he rages meanwhile, bestow on the fool a contemptuous smile. In spite of his anger, continue the same, and ask if he isn't content why he came. Whate'er he replies, pray be careful of this, and do not one word or syllable miss. As soon as he threatens, stand just as you are, but hold up before him this earthenware jar, remarking, 'King Famcram, determined I am to ask you to taste of my raspberry jam.' He'll do it, he must, since the truth for to tell, this jar carries with it a wonderful spell. And when I've said o'er it the words I'll now say, whoever you choose will acknowledge your sway. While kept in your hand, not a difficult task, each person you speak to will do what you ask. And once the jam tasted, you'll have for your slave King Famcram, and teach him the way to behave. But keep the jar safe, for broken or chipped, of your spell and your sway you'll be speedily stripped." With these words the old lady, who, whilst speaking, had pulled out of some pocket or other, or else from the folds of her umbrella, a small jar, now held it aloft in her hand and displayed it before the eyes of Ophelia. As soon as she had done so, for as long a time as she thought fit, she stuck her umbrella firmly into the ground, and holding the jar immediately over it, pronounced certain mystic and fearful words which no mortal of ordinary nature could utter, much less write, and which there is the less reason to mention, because if they were written or uttered, no child of man could possibly understand them. But when she had finished this fearful muttering to herself, she spoke out more loudly, addressing herself thus to the jar and its contents: "Jar, possessed of mighty spell, do thy work and do it well. Serve Ophelia night and day, Famcram bring beneath her sway. Jam, do duty day and night, tempt the royal appetite. Be to Famcram wine and meat, bring him to Ophelia's feet. Cause him eagerly to crave life but as Ophelia's slave. Bow him humbly, bring him down, at her footstool place his crown, and thy mission to fulfil, let him live but by her will." Having finished her incantation, and repeated these lines in a voice sufficiently distinct, though not unlike the croak of a raven, the old woman now turned once more to Ophelia, as if to ascertain whether she had anything more to say. The maiden smiled sweetly upon her, and at once expressed her thanks in the following words: "Dear godmother, how good thou art! The burden now has left my heart, which like a weight has bowed me down, with fear of tyrant Famcram's frown. Well do I know 'twere hard to find a counsellor more wise and kind, and with thy might and magic aid no longer shall I feel afraid. I'll use the jar and jam as told, and very tight the former hold, and when King Famcram is subdued, I, with this magic power imbued, will make him slave and let him know it, and ne'er forget to whom I owe it." So speaking, Ophelia held out her hand for the promised jar, when the old woman, making a stride forward, placed it in her hands, and then, throwing both her arms round the maiden, clasped her tightly in a long and loving embrace, with which she could very well have dispensed. Gratitude, however, for the most immense favour which she was about to receive at the hands of her excellent godmother, prevented her from disclosing the repugnance which she probably felt at the vehemence of the old lady's affection, and having endured it with silent fortitude, she took the jar into her hands, and, bidding her companion a respectful farewell, forthwith re-entered the private door through which she had come, and shortly disappeared within the house. The old woman then took up her umbrella, and slowly descending the bank of the river to the rushes from which she had emerged, speedily became invisible. The shades of night closed in, and darkness soon set its seal upon the pygmy capital and nation. The Chief Justice did not see his daughter that evening, and although he had great confidence in her sagacity, talents, and resources, it must be confessed that he rose next morning with a heavy heart. In all probability, he thought, it was his last day of office, and not only of office, but of freedom. With the fate of the Prime Minister and the Lord Chamberlain before his eyes, how could he possibly hope to escape? For a moment the thought of flight crossed his mind, but was as instantly banished. His hopes, his wealth, his relations, his home, everything that could make life pleasant, was fixed and centred in his native country, and at his age no change was to be thought of or could be endured. And then, where could he fly to, and how escape from the tyrant's spies? No, the thought was madness. The event, be it what it might, must be encountered. The morrow must come in its due course, and, after all, He, a lawyer, a statesman, and a philosopher, ought to be able to put up with his fate at least as well as other people. While the worthy Pigspud thus mused upon the melancholy prospect before him, he was interrupted by the approach of his daughter, the calmness of whose countenance and demeanour was certainly calculated to reassure her anxious parent. However, although she spoke hopefully, and bade the old man take courage, and be sure that things would turn out better than he expected, she told him not one word about her secret interview of the previous evening, or of the powerful assistance she had procured. So the old gentleman passed but a sad day, and could only console himself by resolving to be loyal to the last of his sovereign, and to provide him an entertainment of which he should not be ashamed. Vast indeed were the preparations made for that banquet. So many delicacies had probably not been collected together for one repast within memory of man. Nothing was omitted. From the oysters with which each guest was to be furnished at the beginning, down to the liqueurs at the end of the feast, everything was there, and everything was in perfection. Pigspud had even hired a special poet to compose and recite an ode in praise of the king, but there were doubts expressed as to the complete success of the composition, confined as it was to the doings of the table, and celebrating dishes which were made to tickle the palate by their taste rather than the ear by their well-sung praises. The ode began, "Come servants all, the table put on, well roasted beef and tender mutton. Guests, down your throats white veal and lamb cram, and drink the health of our good King Famcram. Consume the oaten cakes and wheat bread, the calf's foot jelly and the sweetbread, and own the table splendid that is, so well supplied with oyster patties." There was much more of this, in a similar strain, but in the confusion that afterwards followed, and in the interesting events which I shall presently have to chronicle, the ode itself was lost, and as no copies could be afterwards obtained, I am unable to supply the rest of it to the anxious reader. With regard to the entertainment, generally, there was certainly no fault to be found. Old Winnilees and Mrs. Brushamop had surpassed themselves, and the confectioners, cooks, and pastry cooks to whom had been assigned the duties connected with the preparation of the affair had exerted themselves beyond all praise. The decorations were gorgeous, and everything appeared to have been arranged with such care and good taste, and with such an utter disregard of expense, that there were not wanting many, even among those who were acquainted, as who was not, with the upshot of the efforts made by the Prime Minister and the Lord Chamberlain to do honour to their sovereign, who prophesied a greater success and an even triumphant result to the Chief Justice. The hour drew near at which Famcram was expected, and ere long the distant trumpets heralded his approach. The mob cheered him lustily along the streets, not because he was popular, but because he was handsomely dressed, had his crown upon his head, and the famous sceptre in his hand, which facts were quite sufficient to justify a mob in cheering anybody. Nearer and nearer his carriage drew, and at last stopped before the door of Pigspud's mansion. Then, after one last loud flourish, the trumpets ceased to sound. The king alighted to his feet. The Chief Justice received him, kneeling on one knee. Famcram bowed coldly, glanced right and left, and then slowly entered the banqueting room, while his host tremblingly followed behind. His heart balanced between hope and fear, but much, it must be owned, inclining to the latter. The king paused at the entrance of the room. Everything was so beautifully arranged that it was difficult to find fault, even for one who was determined to do so. The flowers, the fruit, the flags, the garlands, the decorations which met his eye, were all so splendid that those who saw them, and I knew at the same time that the tyrant was certain to find some occasion to carry out his purpose, marvelled within themselves what cause for fault-finding he could possibly discover, or what excuse he would be able to invent for his action. They had not long to marvel, however, for the next moment the eyes of all were turned upon Ophelia, who came sauntering down the room between the tables, very leisurely, even carelessly, and advanced towards the king. She was dressed in her morning dress of an unpretending brown colour, fitting closely to the figure, and unadorned by ornament of any kind save a steel chatelaine from which hung her sundry useful articles, scissors, thimble, needle case, and the like, but which added to the suspicion which her general appearance created that she had merely walked from her sitting room to the banqueting hall without any change of toilet in honour of the king. This was quite enough for Famcram, and furnished him with an excuse for anger against his Chief Justice, far more legitimate than those which had been made the pretext for the punishment of his two brother officials. The king lost no time in flying into a violent passion. "What ho!" he cried in as loud a voice as his anger would permit him to raise. "What bold hussy is this who comes to meet her sovereign in common everyday garments? What malapert conduct have we here?" And he strutted forward, puffing and fuming like a turkey cock. Ophelia, who had learned her lesson well, and knew how much depended upon it, paid not the smallest attention to the anger of the king, but advanced towards him with the same careless step and a contemptuous smile upon her countenance. Of course this made matters worse, and the unhappy Pigspud trembled in his shoes in dire anticipation of what would follow, whilst the courtiers and attendants opened their eyes wider than they had ever done at the strange conduct of the infatuated maiden. The sight of the smile upon the maiden's face incensed Famcram to still a greater degree. He stamped violently upon the floor, and turning to the Chief Justice, demanded in imperious tones what was the meaning of this insult. "Who is it?" he cried. "Who is this brazen-faced daughter of a demon who dares to come thus into our presence?" The unhappy Pigspud, in trembling tones, admitted that it was his own daughter. "Your daughter!" exclaimed the king, with a smile, or rather grin, in which fury, triumph, and revenge contended for the mastery. "It is then in your house and by your daughter that I am thus treated? I will deal with you presently, Chief Justice. What do you mean, hussy, by this shameful impudence?" To the surprise of the king himself, and of every person present, Ophelia actually yawned whilst the monarch was speaking, and when he had concluded, kept smiling upon him with palpable contempt, and glancing round at the decorations and beautiful objects right and left of her, remarked in a languid, drawling tone, "If you are not content, King Famcram, why did you come?" This filled up the measure of her iniquity, and drove the king nearly mad. Half beside himself with rage, he seemed to those about him to foam at the mouth as he spluttered forth his furious answer. "Vile wench, you and your father shall suffer for this. You shall, by all that a pygmy holds dear, I swear it. The fate of Binks and Chinks shall be paradise to your lot, you wretched scum of the earth. Ho! Guard, seize these traitors at once, and have the lowest and darkest dungeon made ready for them without delay." A groan burst from the lips of the unfortunate Pigspud as the royal lips pronounced these words, for in them he naturally saw the realization of his worst fears. But before one of the guards could move hand or foot, the fair Ophelia, with the same smile continuously upon her lips, took a step or two forward, and, holding out in her hand the little jar of which we know, but of the existence of which everyone present was profoundly ignorant, said in a remarkably calm and clear voice, "Pray listen, King Famcram. Determined I am to ask you to taste of my raspberry jam." Scarcely were the words out of her mouth, when a perceptible change came over the face, voice, and manner of Famcram. The first turned ghastly white, the second sank to a low whisper, and the third lost all its violence and became as quiet as the manner of a sheep when in the hands of its executioner. One shiver passed over the king's frame, as if there was a strong internal struggle, but it was over in a moment. Murmuring something so indistinctly that no one was quite sure what he said, but apparently something about not liking to refuse a lady, he shuffled forward to meet Ophelia, whilst the crowd around was plunged in the deepest amazement at his strange and altered conduct. The maiden, as he approached, took a small silver salt spoon from the table near her, scooped out of her jar a good spoonful of the jam, and held it to Famcram's mouth. He meekly received the spoon therein, and devoured the jam without a word, good, bad, or indifferent. The next moment he grovelled, literally grovelled at Ophelia's feet, covering them with kisses, and vowing that he was her slave for life. The people could hardly believe their eyes, and looked at each other as if they felt that they must be in a dream, or suffering from some optical delusion, and that it could not be a reality which was passing before them. But Ophelia took it all quite as a matter of course. She ordered Famcram, in haughty tones, to kneel on all fours, and as soon as he had done so, she sat down upon him with the greatest calmness. Wonder upon wonders! The tyrant, who had shown every disposition to treat his people like miserable slaves, seemed now to be reduced to a more abject slavery than the meanest of his vassals. A moment before he was uttering threats of vengeance against his host. Now he was prostrate and humble, the meek servitor of that host's daughter. No one could imagine whence or how this mighty change had come, but the voice of Ophelia soon turned their thoughts to other things. Still seated upon her living stool, she bade the guests be seated, and told them that her father would do the honours. Having seen her power displayed in so miraculous a manner, no one felt the least inclined to disobey her, the more particularly as her commands were by no means of an unwelcome nature, and the feast was one of a very inviting description. No one offered to interfere between the lady and the sovereign, being probably of opinion that to do so would expose themselves to danger without benefit to their lord and master, for whom, moreover, none of them had any very particular affection. Accordingly, they obeyed Ophelia's commands without either reluctance or hesitation, seated themselves at the tables, and began to attack the good things thereupon without any unnecessary delay. Meantime, Ophelia kept her seat, and Famcram, not being particularly strong, soon groaned beneath her weight, especially as she did not try to lighten his burden, but sat as heavy as she could, occasionally lifting her feet from the ground to give greater weight to her body. The king spoke not a word, however, being apparently restrained by some power. He merely panted and breathed deeply, once or twice trembling so as to shake the maiden. Whenever he did so, she struck him a sharp blow on the side of the head with the back of her hand, addressing him at the same time with epithets the reverse of complimentary. "Beast, keep quiet! Be still, you stupid brute!" and such ejaculations were all the king got from his fair mistress, and this continued until the banquet was well nigh over and most of the good things consumed. Then Ophelia arose, and taking the king by the ear, which she pinched and twisted so that an involuntary yell broke from the unhappy sufferer, led him to the head of the table at which her father was presiding. The latter trembled even then, partly for fear of the extraordinary power possessed by his daughter, and perhaps in a greater degree lest it should suddenly fail her after all, the vengeance of the enslaved monarch to be worse to endure than would have been his first anger. No such fear, however, troubled Ophelia, who had her own purpose in what she was now about to do. End of Part 1 of Chapter 5 of Uncle Joe's Stories. Part 2 of Chapter 5 of Uncle Joe's Stories by Edward Knatchbull-Hugesson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Allyson Hester. Part 2 of Chapter 5, Ophelia. She desired to show to the people her great and full power over their sovereign, and this she had already done, but it was by no means part of her plan that they should cease to pay him deference, or at least obedience, for it was through him that she could alone possess that power over them which she fully intended to gain. She therefore caused him to be seated at her father's right hand, and to be supplied with food and drink, of which she directed him to partake. Famcram obeyed at once, meekly and without complaint, and ate what was given to him with a grateful glance at Ophelia, such as a dog might have given to a master who had thrown him a bone. She, meanwhile, seating herself on the other side of her father, listlessly asked for some boiled chicken, and, whilst she trifled with her knife and fork, began to converse upon indifferent subjects, making no allusion whatever to the incidents of the day. This behaviour caused the Chief Justice the greatest astonishment, and at another time he would have demanded explanations of his daughter without delay. But his joy at the unexpected turn which things had taken, and at his own safety, at least for the time, from the peril with which he had been so recently threatened, caused him to take less notice of the matter than he would have otherwise done. To speak the truth, moreover, his joy had been somewhat increased, and his spirits in no small degree elated by an unusual quantity of dry champagne which he had imbibed in the excitement of the moment, so that things appeared natural and reasonable to him which would generally have seemed most extraordinary. Ophelia, meantime, was playing her game well. She judged, and judged rightly, that the conduct of the king in throwing himself at her feet, in allowing her to sit upon him as if he were a chair or stool, and in afterwards meekly following her to the head of the table, would be attributed to nothing else than devoted love by a great many of those who were present, and especially by such as had not been near enough to witness his first outburst of anger, or to hear his first words, which had certainly not been those of affection. This idea would speedily be followed by another, when the guests saw her seated on one side of the Chief Justice, and King Famcram on the other. What could it mean, save that she was about to be raised to the highest dignity in the kingdom, and to share the throne and power of Famcram as his queen? This was, in fact, the resolution which she had formed, and determined to omit no precaution which might ensure its success. So she sat and ate at the banquet, already looking and feeling like a queen, and her device fully succeeded in making the people believe that things were as she desired. But all this would be insufficient without some public avowal on the part of the king, and she resolved that this should be given. Presently, therefore, she leant forward across her father, and, steadily looking at Famcram in the face, thus addressed him: "King, your wish, the anxious wish of your heart, shall be gratified. I consent to become your queen, and you may at once announce the happy tidings to this august assembly." As she said these words, the luckless Famcram turned quite red in the face, and there was visibly another struggle within his breast between contending passions. This struggle lasted longer than the first, and not only did he make no sign of acquiescence to the lady's proposal, but there were those who afterwards declared that they had heard, deep and low, like the sound of a fire struggling to burst loose from walls within which it is enclosed, a sepulchral voice within the king which muttered the words, "I don't want any queen." But whether such words were spoken or not, Ophelia was equal to the occasion. "Jam, dear, did you say?" she asked in her most winning tones, and in another second the salt spoon was out, and a portion of the contents of the little jar transferred without delay to the king's mouth, whilst in a low, determined voice, the maiden continued, speaking in tones which could scarcely be heard by any one save the king himself and the Chief Justice: "Speak out, slave, at once, and acknowledge me as your only queen." Mechanically, as if moved by springs, up rose King Famcram. There was a dead silence for a moment. Then there burst forth a loud cheer, for the guests naturally supposed that the king was about to speak, and knew that it was proper to cheer before he said anything, in order to show that they were ready to do so afterwards. Then again there was a silence, and Famcram spoke these words: "Ophelia Pigspud is my queen, and only she." And down he sat again so suddenly that everybody thought it was by accident, and there must be something more coming. As, however, there was not, it was evidently the duty of all present to cheer again, and this they did most lustily, again and again, though a great many of them had not heard what the king had said. A great many more thought there was something in the proceeding which they could not understand, and still a great many more did not care sixpence, one way or the other, about the announcement. Nevertheless, Ophelia had gained her end. The king had publicly declared that she, and only she, was his queen, and the rest appeared to depend upon herself. By this time the Chief Justice was in a condition which rendered it desirable that no further business of importance should be transacted, for the excitement of the afternoon had been proved altogether too much for him. He was therefore assisted to his room, and retired amid loud cheers from such of the guests as had not made sufficient noise before. Then Ophelia directed the butler and his attendant to conduct Famcram to the state chamber, and to direct the guards to be placed in the usual manner. The courtiers and guests were forthwith dismissed, and the eventful day drew to its close. Many and deep were the thoughts which occupied Ophelia's mind that night. She had a difficult game to play, and though her spirit was high and her courage undaunted, it was impossible that she should not feel some anxiety as to the result. So far, indeed, all had gone well. Famcram, who had evidently entered the banqueting room with no better intentions towards her father and herself than those which he had entertained and carried out in the case of the unhappy families of Binks and Chinks, had been entirely overcome by the magic assistance of her godmother. The jam had proved most efficacious indeed, and the evening had been one continued triumph. But doubts and fears still remained as to the future. At the very moment of the king's recognition of her as his queen, he had but too plainly evinced a disinclination to the step which appeared to indicate that the power of the jam was but temporary, unless, indeed, it was the last struggle of his obstinate nature against that power. He had certainly yielded, and nothing could have been more complete than Ophelia's victory. But then came the question, if the jam had not sufficient force to keep the king enchained as her slave for a longer time than the duration of the banquet, might not its power die away altogether before morning? In that case, what would be her position if the monarch, too wary to see her, and so run the risk of being again subjected to the same treatment, should issue orders directed against her and hers, and fully revenge himself for the events of the previous evening? True, if she retained the jar, she might operate upon his messengers in such a manner as to prevent their inflicting personal injury upon herself, but she would probably be unable to protect her father or his property, as the power she possessed seemed to be personal, closely connected with the jam, and such as could only be exercised when she had the jar in her hand. Suppose again that Famcram should awake during the night, discover that he was not in his own palace, summon his attendants, and surprise her father and slay or capture him whilst asleep. Or suppose he should leave the house by stealth, and that next morning it should be surrounded by royal guards before she was awake, and her jar possibly taken from her. All these thoughts passed constantly through the mind of the daughter of Pigspud, and she got but little rest throughout the whole of that long and dreary night. Early in the morning she arose, performed her toilet with the greatest care, and forthwith descended to the grand drawing-room of the mansion, where several of the courtiers had already assembled. The king had not yet made his appearance, and it must be owned that Ophelia awaited his coming with some anxiety. Presently, however, the doors were thrown open, and the sun shining through the great windows on the staircase, fell full upon the bright red hair of the little monarch, making it brighter than ever. As he slowly descended, Ophelia grasped tightly in her hand the little jar, which she kept concealed in the folds of her dress, quite prepared to have recourse to it again immediately, if occasion should require. She soon saw, however, that she need be under no immediate apprehension. There was a submissive look about Famcram's general appearance, and a humility, even in his squint, which seemed that morning to be more frightful than ever, which greatly reassured the maiden. He came limping into the room, and bowed before her as he entered. Now was the moment when Ophelia's course of action must be clear and certain. She had already resolved upon it, and proceeded according to her determination. To keep Famcram in awe of herself, to preserve their last evening's relations of mistress and slave, was positively necessary, but it was equally desirable not to lower her future husband in the eyes of his courtiers and attendants. She therefore saluted him with a graceful bend of the head, and invited him into the breakfast room, where they took their seats side by side. The Chief Justice was rather late that morning, at which nobody manifested any surprise, having seen that his fatigue was great on the previous evening. Ophelia therefore had everything to do, and she did it admirably. The guests were well treated, the breakfast was excellently arranged, and everybody appeared satisfied and in good spirits. At the conclusion of the repast, Ophelia notified to the king that he should appoint a time that morning at which he would receive his subjects, and publicly fix the day upon which their marriage should be celebrated. The little man made no objection, and trembled visibly when the maiden fixed her eyes upon him. So it was arranged that at a public audience to be held at 12 o'clock, the king should make solemn proclamation of his intended marriage, and that, as delays in such matters were undesirable, the ceremony should be performed the very next day. Thus far had Ophelia Pigspud certainly overcome the evils with which fate had threatened her, and she began to feel confident that all would go well, and that her triumph would be final and complete. 12 o'clock came, and the appointed reception was duly held, the proclamation that it would be so having attracted many of the better class of pygmies. The shortness of the notice was no hindrance to this result. In some countries, I have been told, when subjects are admitted to the presence of their sovereign, they are compelled, whether men or women, to adopt a costume which they never think of wearing at any other time, which is exceedingly inconvenient and sometimes ridiculous. Although these ceremonies take place, like the royal receptions in Pygmyland, in the broad daylight, the ladies who attend are obliged to do so in dresses more fit for evening parties, with their heads fantastically arranged and crowned with feathers, more ludicrous than imposing, while, irrespective of weather, their throats and chests are exposed in a manner exceedingly likely to produce colds and coughs and such like undesirable ailments. The gentlemen, all armed with swords, as if the sovereign was likely to order a sudden attack upon them, or to require their services in order to repel one upon himself, are dressed in various degrees of absurdity, according to the particular rank or grade to which each belongs, but no one wears an ordinary dress, and the whole thing is somewhat like a fancy ball or a masquerade without the masks. These, however, are of course only half civilized people, and not an intelligent and progressive race such as the pygmies. The latter appear before their monarch in their ordinary clothes, the only regulation being that they shall be decent and respectable, as in fact they always are. Thus the sovereign sees his people as they really are, whilst they, on their part, come into the royal presence without restraint, or the uncomfortable feeling of presenting an appearance similar to that of a jackdaw in peacock's feathers. This ensures a large attendance on reception days, which are also the more frequently held, and at short notice, since they do not entail upon the people, as in the countries to which I have alluded, the necessity of long notice to dressmakers and tailors, and the not inconsiderable expense contingent upon dealings with such people. So, although the proclamation was only made upon the same morning, the greater part of the aristocracy of Famcram's capital, together with many of the middle classes who were not excluded from that court, attended his reception. Ophelia stood by his side, carefully retaining the jar of jam all the time, and the little monarch was as submissive as upon the previous day. The people saw and recognized her position. Whether they murmured at all, or entertained any objection to the sudden elevation of the daughter of Pigspud, I cannot say, but at all events no such feeling was evinced. The reception passed off as well as Ophelia could possibly have wished, and Famcram was as much her slave as ever. For greater security, she gave him a small piece of bread and jam immediately after luncheon, and he really seemed to require no more in order to keep him perfectly submissive and obedient to the will of his mistress. Of course, it was necessary to make great preparations for the next day. Chief Justice Pigspud, finding his daughter's position, to all appearance, firmly established, took heart again, recovered much of his former confidence, and began to hold up his head and to prepare to take a full share in the future government of the kingdom. He naturally took the lead in arranging the proceedings of the following day, the more especially as Famcram seemed to have suddenly changed his character. Instead of being captious, jealous, ill-tempered, arbitrary, and tyrannical, he appeared to have subsided into a meek, quiet, timid being who hardly dared call his soul his own. He spoke, looked, and moved as if in a kind of stupor, and obeyed every command of Ophelia without a protest or even a murmur of objection. The Chief Justice, seeing that this result had been obtained in some mysterious way, was too well satisfied with it to trouble his daughter by inquiries into the means she had used or the agencies she had employed. It is due to the old man to say that he suspected nothing unlawful, but even had he entertained such suspicions, I do not know that he would have deemed it necessary to take any action upon them, since, whatever the means taken, the end secured had been one so desirable. With all his faults, Pigspud was not without generosity, and now that he saw good prospects of prosperity before him and his house, he bethought himself of his old associates, Binks and Chinks, and determined, if possible, to effect their release from unmerited imprisonment. With this object he went to his daughter in the afternoon of the day before the wedding, representing to her that it would be a graceful act on her part, and one likely to be popular with the people, if she were to persuade the king to release his old ministers and their families, and invite them to be present at his approaching nuptials. Ophelia was somewhat vexed at the request. She hardly felt as yet sufficiently secure in her position to run any risks, and although she would have been glad enough to have aided in the release of the Prime Minister and the Lord Chamberlain, an indefinable something seemed to tell her that in the daughters of the two ministers she would find enemies who had better not be placed in any position in which they could possibly do harm. She knew the power which jealousy has over the female mind, that is to say, in Pygmyland, though of course in ordinary countries such a feeling is unknown to the softer sex, and she feared she knew not what. However, she felt that it would be ungracious as well as ungrateful to refuse her father his first request, and she, therefore, told Famcram that the prisoners must be released in order to be present at the wedding the next day. The king raised no objection, but did as he was told, and orders were immediately sent to the dungeons for the liberation of the ex-ministers and their families, at which they were, of course, delighted. But some difficulty was experienced after their release from prison as to where they should go, inasmuch as King Famcram had appropriated all of their property. As, however, their respective houses remained unoccupied, they were permitted to return thither, and make themselves as comfortable as they could. The ladies of the party were the worst off, and great were their complaints of total inability to appear in proper dresses at the festivities on the ensuing day. Ophelia felt for their difficulty, and did all she could to remove it, supplying them with many articles of dress from her own wardrobe, and assuring them of her sincere sympathy for their sufferings in the past and her readiness to promote their happiness in the future. So when the morning fixed for the royal marriage dawned, all seemed likely to go well, and content reigned upon the face of every pygmy. Owing to a conflagration which, at a subsequent period, destroyed all the records in the public offices of that country, I am unable to supply my readers with a full and accurate account of all the details of the interesting ceremony which united Ophelia to her royal husband. Various accounts were written and published at the time, but none of them by authority, and I am unwilling to trust unauthorized narratives when dealing with a subject of such immense importance. That which it most concerns us to know, however, is that the wedding actually took place, which fact having been once ascertained, even the appearance of the bride and the dresses of the bridesmaids become matters of comparatively little moment. Of this great fact there is happily no doubt. King Famcram was legally married to Ophelia Pigspud after the custom of pygmy marriages, and the maiden was undoubtedly queen of the pygmies. Her first act was at once gracious and becoming. She caused Binks and Chinks to be reinstated to their former offices, and arranged that pecuniary compensation should be given them for the losses they had sustained. Furthermore, she appointed Euphemia and Araminta Binks, together with the 3 daughters of the Lord Chamberlain, Asphalia, Bettina, and Paraphernalia, as her ladies-in-waiting, and promised to them and to herself that the court should ever be made the scene of gaieties and entertainments to which it had long been a stranger. But however good were the motives of Ophelia, however kind her feeling towards these 5 young ladies, however pleasant her plans might have appeared to them under other circumstances, I am sorry to say they neither believed in nor appreciated them. Feelings of jealousy had sprung up within their tender breasts from the first moment that they had found Ophelia preferred to the throne before themselves. Possessed, as has been related, of beauty, wit, and fascination in different degrees, but in the case of each of them, a superior degree to the generality of maidens, they felt they had, each and all, as good a right to have shared the throne of Famcram as the more fortunate damsel who had obtained that position. Instead, therefore, of being loyal to Ophelia and grateful for her kindness towards them, they regarded her with envy and spite, and their beautiful faces but ill reflected the ugly feelings which occupied their hearts. Ignorant of this, Ophelia had forgotten her first fears and doubts upon the question of their release, and, unsuspicious of evil, kept one or other of the maidens constantly near her. For a day or 2 all went well. The king kept in the same state of torpor, and his passive obedience to his wife made him, in the general opinion of pygmy ladies, a model for all husbands. Ophelia, however, knowing the source from which her power was derived, kept her jar always at hand, so that she might be able to have immediate recourse to it if the occasion should arise. It was not extraordinary that, under these circumstances, her ladies-in-waiting should become acquainted with, and take notice of, the fact. It became, very shortly after their appointment, a matter of conversation amongst them, and of wonder that the queen should always carry about with her a common-looking little jar, of which they knew neither the use nor the contents. Paraphernalia, the youngest and prettiest of the Chinks family, wished to ask a question about it outright, but the worldly wisdom of her elder sisters checked her, for they feared that their position at court might be imperilled by any forwardness or impertinence of the kind. Whether Ophelia, if asked, would have given such information, or at least have dropped such hints as might have prevented the occurrence of the facts I am about to relate, cannot be known. The opportunity was not afforded her, and the 5 ladies-in-waiting remained in ignorance upon the subject. On the 3rd day after her marriage, Ophelia was to receive the ladies of the court and such of the fairer portion of Pygmyland as desired to be presented to her. She was richly arrayed in garments well suited to the occasion, and looked right royal as she stood to receive her guests. The king, with meek and submissive gait, stood by her side, and never had she looked more lovely or felt more triumphant. Resolved, however, to take care of safety as well as of appearance, she kept in her left hand the little jar, having a scarf lightly thrown over her arm and concealing it from view. It had not, however, escaped the sharp eyes of Paraphernalia Chinks, who determined in her own mind that the day should not pass by without her knowing something more about the evident mystery to which that jar related. The ladies in waiting were, naturally enough, near the queen, and stood looking on whilst those who were presented to her majesty trooped by, making their reverent obeisances as they did so. After a while, Ophelia began to feel rather tired of bowing and smiling, but still continued graciously to do so, until an elderly dame in passing tripped over her train and seemed in danger of falling. The queen made an involuntary movement forward as if to save her, and in so doing happened to loosen her hold upon the jar in her left hand. At the very same instant, Paraphernalia, who had been watching her opportunity all the time, started forward as if to assist her majesty, and, as if by accident, gave a violent push to her left arm, when, sad to relate, the jar fell from her hand upon the marble pavement at her feet, and was instantly broken to pieces. At the sight of the contents, which appeared to be ordinary jam, the ladies in waiting could hardly restrain themselves from exclamations of surprise, and all the more so when they perceived the pallor which immediately overspread the countenance of the queen. But their attention was at once directed to something else. Scarcely had the accident happened, and the jar slipped from Ophelia's grasp, and met with the fate I have described, when a great and marvellous change came over the appearance and demeanour of the king. No longer meek and subdued, his countenance flushed with rage, his squinting appeared more furiously malicious than ever, and he stood before the court, not the obedient slave and husband, but once more the tyrant Famcram, restored to his former self. He passed his hand across his brow, as if to sweep away from him some unpleasant memories, and then glared fiercely around him for a minute without uttering a syllable. There was a dead silence. Everybody feared some dreadful outburst, and nobody knew what to expect. Then Famcram broke forth in fury. "What sorcery is here?" he cried. "What witchcraft has been going on? What drab is this whom I see beside me, assuming a place as if she were queen? Who are these overdressed peacocks on every side? Toads, vipers, serpents? Ho, guards, away with them!" And again he looked with frightful grimaces upon those who stood about him. Binks, Chinks, and Pigspud fell instantly on their knees, all in a row. The ladies in waiting, between trembling and fainting, did nothing for the moment, whilst Ophelia, recognizing at once that her power of compulsion was gone, resolved to make an instant appeal to the better feelings of the king. "Sire," she said, turning round and confronting him with dignity, "I am your lawful queen. 3 days ago you wedded me, and I share your throne. Pray let us govern with justice and mercy, and you shall never have cause to repent of having elevated me to this position." "Position? You? Throne? Queen? Us govern?" shrieked Famcram at the top of his voice, now perfectly beside himself with fury. "You fool! You idiot! You jackanapes! You witch! You vile creature! You a queen, forsooth! Out upon your folly, that led you to try and deceive Famcram! Seize her, guards!" he continued. "Seize the whole lot of them! Strip off their fine robes, and away with them to the palace dungeons! We will soon see who is to be king and master here." As he spoke, the obedient guards came forward, and, in spite of all that Ophelia could do or say, stripped her of her ornaments and cloak of rich fur, took from her head the crown with which the queens of that country were always decorated on state occasions, and began to drag her away. Famcram grinned with malicious spite as he saw her in the hands of his rough attendants. "Ah!" said he, "this is real jam now." And from these casual words of the king sprang an expression which has now become proverbial in that country, indicating some special pleasure or remarkably gratifying incident. Ophelia was not alone in her misfortune. Her 5 ladies in waiting were all seized at the same time, their fine clothing taken from them, and themselves conveyed back again to the same dungeons which they had previously occupied, and which the wretched Ophelia now shared with them. Their behaviour to the fallen queen was, I am sorry to say, neither ladylike nor generous. Forgetful of the fact that it was to her they had owed their liberty, and that she had shown them all possible kindness during her brief period of prosperity, they only remembered that it was through her discomfiture that they were themselves suffering at the moment. They overwhelmed her with reproaches, in which Paraphernalia, herself the real cause of their joint misfortune, was especially forward, and not content with this, the 3 daughters of Chinks set upon her, cuffed her, scratched her, slapped her, pulled her hair, and vowed that they would do much worse before they had done with her. Paraphernalia went so far as to suggest cutting off all her hair and spoiling her beauty by burning or otherwise marking her face, but the others had hardly come to such a state of wickedness and malice as this, although they joined in making the poor girl more miserable than she would have otherwise been, and showed a want of consideration and good feeling which was much to be blamed. The discomfort and misery of all the ladies were, as may be supposed, considerable, nor was their condition at all improved by the news that Famcram had resolved that the parents of the 3 families, Binks, Chinks, and Pigspud, should be executed in the public market place within 3 days. This news, conveyed to them by some of those officious persons who always like to bring unpleasant tidings, if only that they may watch their effects upon the people they are likely to make unhappy, plunged all 6 ladies into the deepest sorrow. Nor was the next piece of news at all calculated to lighten the burden of affliction which weighed them down. Famcram sent a special messenger to inform the captives that they should all suffer the extreme penalty of the law also. At first he had declared that they should be publicly whipped in the square opposite the palace, and afterwards beheaded; but, upon an earnest representation being made to him by a deputation from the Anti-Flogging Society, who were numerous in the city, he consented to forego that part of the punishment, and to have them sewn up in sacks and thrown into the river, which was a form of punishment much in vogue in that part of the world. Resolved, however, to make them suffer as much as possible, he directed that their execution should take place upon the day preceding that of their fathers, and that the latter should be obliged to tie the mouths of the sacks, and roll their own children into the water. The girls heard this doom with horror, but there was no way of averting it. On the morning of the day on which the sentence was to be carried into effect, the daughters of Chinks became more furious than ever against Ophelia, and declared she ought to be scratched to death in the dungeon, and not share the fate of the honourable damsels like themselves. But a better spirit had come over Euphemia and Araminta, the daughters of the late Prime Minister. They had felt some compunction at the treatment of Ophelia by their friends and prison companions, and had not joined in the personal attack which had been led by Paraphernalia. And when they remembered how Ophelia had behaved as queen, and saw how meekly she bore the cruel insults now heaped upon her by the others, they spoke out boldly, and interfered to prevent further violence. So the hours passed by until the afternoon arrived, and all 6 ladies, having a thick, coarse, white sheet cast round each of them, as if about to stand and do penance, were led forth from the palace dungeons and taken to the appointed place of execution. Everything had been arranged under the direct orders of the tyrant himself. Marshalled 2 and 2 between their guards, the poor girls found that they had to pass through a crowd of gaping and staring people, and to walk over the mud and stones upon their bare feet. Their beauty attracted general notice, but Ophelia's form and bearing made by far the greatest impression upon the bystanders. Side by side she walked by Euphemia Binks, but the latter's beauty was entirely eclipsed by that of the late queen. The daughter of Pigspud walked with a royal air, upright, majestic in figure, with a look of resignation and yet contempt of fate. She excited an universal feeling of pity and admiration. Low murmurs were heard among the crowd, and whispers which, had they come to Famcram's ears, would certainly have caused the whisperers trouble. The tyrant, however, was so much feared, and the loyalty of pygmies is ever so devoted, even when their sovereign is one whom no one can love or respect, that no sign of an outbreak was shown. Slowly the mournful procession marched upon its way until it reached the road leading directly to the river. At this moment the great cathedral bell began to toll, filling the hearts of those who heard it with a certain awful feeling impossible to be described in words, which was increased in intensity when men in black garments, with masks over their faces, appeared, carrying the sacks which were to be employed in the execution of the unhappy maidens. With a refinement of cruelty, the brutal tyrant had directed that the procession should turn aside and pass through the hall of the Chief Justice's house, so that Ophelia, in her disgrace and misery, should be made to look upon the place in which her recent but short-lived triumph had occurred. So they marched into the house, and through the great banqueting room, and out into the gardens, and as they slowly descended to the river, again the solemn, deep, death-warning clang of the cathedral bell sounded in their ears, and the girls knew that now indeed their end was very near. Close to the spot which he had fixed for the execution, in a magnificent armchair, upon a kind of temporary dais erected for the occasion, sat Famcram himself, uglier than ever, with his crown upon his head, and the famous sceptre in his hand. As the procession drew near, he arose from his chair, around which stood his principal courtiers, whilst at a little distance might be observed the wretched Binks, Chinks, and Pigspud, each guarded by 2 armed attendants. When the ladies had approached quite close to the king, he grinned upon them with more than his usual malice, and began to sneer at and abuse them. "Is this our queen?" he asked in a jeering tone, "the queen that was to share our throne? And it was to be us who would govern it, was it not? Poor wretch! The bed of the river will soon be your royal couch, and you shall share it with the eels, if," and here he grinned horribly, "they can make their way through the sack which will hold your lovely form. You to be queen, you nasty, staring, goggle-eyed vixen! And here come our prime minister's and lord chamberlain's children. Pretty ducklings, you shall be sewn up nice and tight, and your own fathers shall give you to the pike and the rats. Nice tender morsels for these ye will be." To these taunts the poor girls made no reply, and the tyrant continued to insult them, having ordered the procession to stand still for the purpose. And still the great bell tolled on. They had stopped very near to the river, and now, at a signal from the king, the men clothed in black came forward with the sacks. The white sheets were taken from the fair shoulders of the victims, and each was thrust into her sack in the dishevelled garments she wore, and left there for a few moments, until the unhappy fathers should perform the duties assigned to them. Up to this time Ophelia had kept silence. She despised the wretched Famcram too much to condescend to answer his taunts. If death was to be met, she would meet it like a true daughter of Pigspud, and her ancient lineage should never be disgraced by her behaviour. But at this extreme moment a ray of hope darted suddenly into her heart. Where was she? Upon the very spot where she had received the mystic jar which had worked for her such wonders. The place was the same. The hour, though not so late, was probably not unpropitious, for the sun was beginning to sink behind the higher buildings of the city. Was it impossible that the same power which had helped her before might again befriend her? The effort was at least worth making, and failure could make matters no worse. So, even in the sack, before it was closed over her head, with enemies seemingly all around, and death staring her in the face, Ophelia lifted up her head, and looking towards the river, slowly pronounced these words: "Marley, quarley, patchel, farley, monsto, mackin, furlis, sparley, mondo, pondo, sitio, pinto, framsigalen, hanno, tinto." Everybody was surprised at the words and behaviour of the unfortunate lady, but what followed surprised them infinitely more. A curious whining, murmuring, incomprehensible sound came along the banks of the river, filling the hearts of those who heard it with a strange sense of fear, and a feeling that something wonderful was about to happen. The river, too, instead of flowing on in its usual quiet and majestic manner, seemed perturbed in an extraordinary manner, and became as rough as the open ocean in a storm. By common consent, every one who was present stood as if struck by one feeling of awe, which palsied and unfitted them for action. The men who were supporting the sacks in which the unhappy maidens stood, shivering with fear, remained rooted to their places, and mingled fear and wonder sat upon the faces of the people. Then slowly arose from the rushes by the waterside the same grotesque figure which had once before held converse with Ophelia. The red cloak, the umbrella, the poke bonnet, the keen eye, were all there, and the old woman stood upon the bank within a very short distance of the sacks. She looked round upon the people, as if rather surprised at seeing them there, but appeared after a short time to have eyes only for Ophelia, upon whom she fixed her gaze attentively, and striking her umbrella upon the ground, accosted her in the following words: "What is it, Ophelia, and what do you fear? That you've called your affectionate godmother here. Have matters gone wrong since you wanted me last? I fear that they have, as my eyes round I cast. You haven't got on the same dress that you wore when you came down to see the old lady before, and unless my old eyesight its certainty lacks, you seem hampered and bound in the coarsest of sacks. And some other girls too, in what sad plight you are! My darling, has aught gone amiss with the jar?" In a mournful voice Ophelia replied at once: "Dear godmother, my woes are great, and miserable is my fate. The jar is broken, and I am both out of luck and out of jam. This cruel tyrant whom I wed, I would I'd been at Bath instead, his senses managed to recover, and now no more obedient lover, used language really quite past bearing, he always was too prone to swearing, swore I no more his wealth should sponge on, and clapped me in a dirty dungeon. And then, his wrath no way abating, my ladies, 5 of them, in waiting, he also sent there scarce politely, and though they've not behaved quite rightly, they scarcely have in crime abounded, so much as to be sacked and drowned. Though if my throne I once were back in, I should have given 3 a sacking. But godmother, see what I'm brought to. That naughty king, he didn't ought to." Ophelia sobbed aloud when she had concluded these words, which were uttered somewhat incoherently, as if the poor girl was quite overcome by her misfortune. But scarcely had she finished, when the old woman strode up to the sack without another word, and, drawing a large pair of scissors from her belt, immediately cut it open in such a manner that the maiden was set free. Up to this time King Famcram had remained quiet, as if sharing in the general fear and astonishment. No sooner, however, did he see that the old woman's purpose was to set free at least one of his prisoners, and that the chief offender, than fear gave way to wrath, and he leaped up from his armchair in a tremendous passion. "Who is this?" he cried loudly. "Who is this that interferes with the king's sentence? Seize her, guards! Vile hag, you shall soon receive your deserts." But not a guard moved. Some power greater than that of Famcram seemed to restrain him, and the old woman quietly accomplished her task without taking the slightest notice of anybody but Ophelia. When the latter was free and standing by her side, she once more spoke in the same masculine voice as at first, and smiling upon the maiden, thus addressed her: "Though jars may be broken and jam may be spoiled, the plans of your godmother never are foiled, and power and goodwill I must certainly lack, ere my favourite godchild be drowned in a sack. Yet if you desire it, my goddaughter sweet, these ladies of thine shall their recompense meet, and since they've behaved, dear, so badly to thee, we'll give them a ducking. Just say, shall it be?" Ophelia, who now began to feel sure that she was safe, was too much rejoiced thereat to wish harm to anyone else, and in a few well chosen words she begged her grandmother not to be severe on the poor creatures who, she was certain, would never do it again. She also told her of the better behaviour of the two daughters of Binks, upon which the old lady cut their sacks open immediately, but could hardly be restrained from punishing the others, especially Paraphernalia, who cried like a great baby from sheer fright, and begged Ophelia to forgive her. The godmother then took from her finger a ring which she held before Ophelia, and addressed her in these words: "I give thee, my daughter, this emerald ring. Its colour, you see, is a wonderful green, and though you may lose your detestable king, you still shall be owned as the Pygmy land queen. Reign long and be happy through many bright days. May all your past troubles your happiness prove. And would you be safe, hear what godmother says: be kind to your people and govern by love." As she said these words, the old woman placed the ring upon Ophelia's finger, and smiled upon her in an affectionate manner. At this moment Famcram's rage grew beyond all bounds. He literally foamed at the mouth with fury, both at the scene which was being enacted before his eyes, and the unwillingness or impotence of his guards to help him. He yelled out to them again at the top of his voice, whilst his red hair seemed to blaze with fury as he whirled his sceptre round his head. "Seize the vile witch, I say!" he shouted. "Who dares to talk of anyone reigning here while Famcram lives? Seize her and burn her, varlets! Will none of ye stand by your king?" With these words the king jumped from the dais on which he had been sitting, and rushed forward himself, calling loudly to his guards to come on. But his cries were to no purpose. Every man stood rooted to the ground, and not a hand was lifted to help the tyrant. Then the smile left the face of the old woman, and she turned from Ophelia to face the king. He paused, as she raised her hand and pointed at him with her umbrella, while she spoke again in the same voice as before, and these were her words: "Thou slayer of women, disgrace to thy line! The vengeance is near, be thy punishment mine. You wished my dear godchild in river to drown? No, no, tyrant Famcram, this time you're done brown." She had no time for more, for, overcoming his fear, or whatever had hitherto restrained him, the little tyrant rushed upon her. The old woman now adopted a most curious course. Dropping her umbrella to the ground, she made no more ado, but seized Famcram the moment he was within reach, wrenched his sceptre from him, and shook him severely. He struggled, bit, kicked, and yelled, but it was all in vain. That fearful grasp was upon him, against which 20 times his strength had been of no avail. The fight, if such indeed it could be called, was soon over. The wretched creature writhed in the hands of his enemy, who shook him to her heart's content, and then, raising him with apparent ease by the scruff of the neck, calmly placed him in the sack from which she had just liberated her goddaughter. In spite of his continued struggles, she swiftly tied the mouth of the sack into a knot, which she managed to make, and then, without a word more, good, bad, or indifferent, descended the bank, threw in the sack, and sat down upon it. To the surprise of the people, instead of sinking, the sack floated away into the midst of the river, which boiled and surged around it, so that every now and then it went down, and then came up again in sight of the crowd, the old woman keeping her seat upon it all the time, and smiling grimly as she bobbed up and down in a manner which would have made many respectable old ladies of my acquaintance feel remarkably unwell. No such effect, however, was produced upon the old woman, and she apparently enjoyed the whole thing very much. When they first left the bank, stifled screams were heard issuing from the sack, but these soon died away, and it was plain enough that the wretched Famcram must have been very speedily drowned. In a little while the old woman and the sack had floated out of sight, and the people began to recover somewhat from their amazement. Then occurred another marvellous thing. The river suddenly rose in several places, in the form of a waterspout, and came dashing over the crowd. But the extraordinary part of it was, that whilst it drenched and half drowned the black executioners and all Famcram's particular friends, Ophelia and those who were on her side were not touched by it. The courtiers and guards of Famcram turned and fled. Then, after a short pause, the three late ministers, Binks, Chinks, and Pigspud, came forward together and knelt at Ophelia's feet. Binks was the spokesman of the party. "Madame," he said, "after what has just happened, we cannot doubt that a higher power than ours has designated you as our queen. I am sure that I speak in the name of all that is great, good, and powerful in Pygmyland, when I ask you to reign over us in the place of him who has proved himself so unworthy to do so." Ophelia replied at once. "Rise, sir," she said, "and you too, dear father, for it is not meet that you should kneel before your child. There might, doubtless, have been found worthier sovereigns for our country, but since fate has thus decreed it, I accept the position which is offered." As soon as the words were out of her mouth, loud shouts of joy broke forth from the surrounding people. At a sign from Ophelia, the other damsels were all set free, and they now came and stood humbly before her, expressing in meek and lowly tones their deep contrition for the offences they had committed against her. Paraphernalia was especially vehement in her expressions of regret, vowing that she had always entertained the greatest affection for Ophelia, and that if some demon had not possessed her, she should never have acted as she had done. Her sisters made various protestations of the same sort, whilst Euphemia and Araminta stood with blushing cheeks and downcast eyes awaiting the queen's decision. Ophelia did not keep them long in suspense. She told the two daughters of the prime minister that she freely forgave them all that had occurred, being satisfied that it was not from them or their hostility that it arose. Moreover, they had been the playmates of her childhood, and she should wish still to retain them about her person. She told the daughters of the Lord Chamberlain, however, that she must take a different course with them. At these words, Asphalia, Bettina, and Paraphernalia burst into a dreadful howl, and the latter threw herself at the feet of Ophelia and endeavoured to kiss them. But the queen bade her arise, and told her that she and her sisters need not fear that the commencement of her reign would be sullied by the infliction of any severe punishment upon those who had been her companions in misfortune. Upon this, Paraphernalia turned joyous again, and began vociferously to express her thanks, but was again stopped by the royal lady. "I cannot have about my court," she said, "persons who have behaved as you have done, nor indeed can I retain you in my service. I wish that I could have done so for your father's sake, but he must himself acknowledge that it is impossible. Out of respect to him, I will only condemn Asphalia and Bettina to be confined to the limits of the city walls for a year, but during that time they will be forbidden to attend my court. As for Paraphernalia, she must be banished from Pygmyland altogether until I shall have proofs, which I much doubt of my ever receiving, of her entire reformation of character." At this decision, the unhappy Paraphernalia raised a shrill scream and fell fainting upon the ground, but was speedily carried off by the attendants. Her sisters, who felt that they had deserved and fully expected to share her fate, returned thanks to Ophelia for her great clemency, and vowed to lead such lives as should convince her of their undying loyalty and sincere devotion to her throne and person. These professions the queen received with a gracious inclination of the head, and expressed her hope that they might prove to be founded on a true desire on the part of the damsels to repent of the past and do better for the future. She then turned to her father and requested that he, Binks, and Chinks would again resume their former offices, and render her their best assistance in carrying on the government of the country. To this the three statesmen readily assented, having, in fact, desired nothing better. Ophelia, in the first place, directed them to prepare a proclamation, announcing her accession to the throne, and her determination to govern upon constitutional principles, which, being a high-sounding phrase, and one which nobody exactly understood, naturally gave great satisfaction. One or two discontented people did indeed whisper that as the constitution of Pygmyland had always been a pure despotism, Ophelia only meant to say that she should rule as other Pygmy kings and queens had ruled before her. These murmurs, however, were soon silenced, and this the more effectually when the queen issued the next day a second proclamation, in which she gave free pardon to all those who had supported Famcram in his late acts of tyranny, provided they would at once acknowledge her as their sovereign and obey her authority. Some people, indeed, objected to this proclamation, on the ground that those who had obeyed Famcram, whether he had been right or wrong, were only acting in accordance with the country's laws and carrying out the orders of their lawful sovereign, which he undoubtedly was, and required no pardon at all. But these people, again, were held to be mere cavaliers and idle talkers, and so general was Ophelia's popularity that whatever she might have chosen to make the subject of a proclamation would have been hailed with delight by her loving and loyal subjects. She ascended the throne under the happiest auspices. The goodwill of her people filled her heart with happiness and strengthened the stability of her throne, whilst her great talents secured for her kingdom the blessings of good government. Her many virtues afforded a bright example to all her subjects, and her reign was, throughout, that which it promised at first to become, an era of unmixed happiness and prosperity to Pygmyland. End of Chapter 5 of Uncle Joe's Stories. Part 1 of Chapter 6 of Uncle Joe's Stories. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Allyson Hester. Part 1 of Chapter 6. The Crones of Mersham. Things are very dull nowadays in the country districts of England. The country gentlemen have got into the habit of going to London a great deal more than they used to before railroads were made as extensively as has been the case of late years. The farmers, too, move about more than they did in the olden days, and act very differently in many respects from their forefathers. Nor are the labourers quite the same. They ask more wages, touch their hats to master, squire, and parson less than they did, and discuss matters of politics and the government of the country which formerly never entered their heads. I dare say it is all right. It is a wise and good frame of mind to cherish, which teaches one that whatever is right, although it is sometimes very difficult to think so. For instance, when my tooth takes to aching without any obvious cause, and certainly very much against my will, the fact of its doing so is well established, but the existing state of things in my face is not recognized by me, not for one single moment, as right, because it is the existing state. And when I have overdrawn my account at my banker's, and the state of things is that he will not let me do so any more, The circumstance that it is so does not reconcile me to the fact in the very slightest degree. Still, as regards the progress which this country has made, and the condition at which we have now arrived, I am ready to bow my head meekly, and allow that, as a general maxim, the general results may be admitted by me to be all right. There are the railroads, and, though the carriages are not always comfortable and the trains generally late, they afford such facilities for the gentry folk to go to town that we cannot wonder at their doing so. If it is not right that they should, surely railroads would have never been permitted, cutting up the beautiful country as they do, and sending their screaming engines along through the green fields and thriving plough lands, where all before was peaceful and quiet. Then, if the farmers are changed, it is also all for the best, without doubt. Changed they are, beyond all question. They are a different class of men from the old species of farmer who existed 50 years ago, and who seldom went further than his market town. Our farmers nowadays have all visited London again and again, and instead of the homely talk over a market dinner which used to take place in the old days, they have got chambers of agriculture, in which they evince a remarkable ability in discussing anything which Parliament proposes to do about agricultural matters, and talk nearly as wisely, I am told, as the members of the House of Commons itself. Still, however, I stick to my text, and say that, being as it is, it must be all right. Of course it is, and so also with regard to the labourers. When I was a boy, they did not know half as much as they do now, but they worked well for that. I have lodged in 2 rooms in this farmhouse, in which I write for 27 years come next Michaelmas, and have often heard Farmer Barrett say that his best labourers were generally those who could neither read nor write. Most of them can do both now, and people used to say that it was a sin and a shame that every labourer should not be able to read his Bible and write his name in it. All right, again I say, only unfortunately, as sometimes I venture to think, it is not their Bibles they read so much as the penny papers, and these sometimes teach them different lessons from the Bible, I fancy. Then there is a lot of cheap, trash, I was going to say, and I think I must, too. A lot of cheap trash, which is sent about all over the country, or which they pick up here and there, and which teaches them lessons altogether mischievous. Moreover, they have societies, which are curious sorts of concerns, I am told, and through which they are taught actually to demand an increase of wages, and various other things which were never thought of in old times. All these things have made the country districts of England very different places from what they used to be when I first knew them. That is now a long time ago, but I know a great deal that happened before I knew anything from my own eyesight and observation. I mean, before I was born. I am an old man now, and having enough money to live upon and be comfortable, I have all my lifetime indulged in my inclination for living in the country. I used to make it my principal endeavour to avoid railways. I hired lodgings in rustic villages, and lived quietly therein, studying the ways and habits of the people, and picking up old legends, which was always my chief delight. But wherever I went, a railroad was sure to be immediately afterwards projected through that particular district. The steam fiend seemed to have marked me out as an involuntary pioneer to herald his advance, and move where I would, he and his myrmidons very shortly appeared in my wake. This continued for 25 years, for I began my system of country lodging when I was a tolerably young man, barely turned 30. When I tell you, as I did just now, that I have been in my present abode for 27 years, a little calculation will show you that I shall never again see my 82nd birthday. You will, therefore, I hope, excuse the garrulity of old age, and forgive me if I have somewhat wandered from the tale which in fact I have not yet begun, but which I have been leading up to all this time. For you must know that the changes of which I have been speaking have had great effect upon other people besides gentry, farmers, and labourers. There are nothing like so many witches, wizards, and curious creatures of that kind as there were in country places in the good old times. I do not for one moment say that this is to be regretted. On the contrary, I say again that being so, I have no doubt it is all right. But, right or wrong, it is undoubtedly true that the witches, warlocks, and wise women have greatly diminished, if indeed they have not altogether vanished. I hope it will be understood that by wise women I do not allude to the ladies who give scientific lectures and talk about a variety of subjects upon which they evidently know much more than an old gentleman like I am could ever know, and I must say, more than I should like to know about some things. This is a different kind of wisdom altogether, and there are plenty of persons who possess it, or think they do, which serves their purpose quite as well. I mean wise in the sense of possessing an unusual and supernatural insight into things which are commonly hidden from mortal knowledge. Of these people there are few, if any, left in the present day, or if there are such, they do not come to the front as they once did. There are indeed many persons in the world now who actually disbelieve in witches and all creatures of that sort, and who not only disbelieve in their existence now, but who stoutly maintain that they never did exist. I don't know how they get over the Witch of Endor, or the various other allusions to witches in the Bible, but I suppose they do somehow or other. People are much too clever for me nowadays, and get over any difficulty that comes in their way, or fancy that they do so, and trouble themselves no more about it. I have even heard people disbelieve in fairies, but that of course is sheer nonsense, and no one who wanders, as I have often done, at all seasons and at all hours, through the glorious English woodlands, can doubt the existence of the dear little elves. Doubt their existence? I should as soon think of doubting my own. How do the fairy rings come, I should like to know? Whence comes the name of the fairy well? Not uncommon by any means. Oh no, I do not believe that anybody disbelieves that fairies exist, though I know that there is a dreadful amount of unbelief in the world regarding warlocks and witches. I am glad to say that good Farmer Barrett was never one of the unbelievers. He was near upon 70 when I first came to lodge under his roof, so that if he had lived till now he would have been 97. As he didn't, however, it is no use making the remark. He died some 12 years ago, when about 85, cut off, as one might say, in the prime of life. Ah me, how our friends, young and old, fall around us like grass! My godson, Jack Barrett, here remarks, with less of reverence than I could have wished, in speaking of his grandfather, that a man taken away at 85 would be better compared to hay than grass. Well, well, Jack is young, barely 40, and boys must have their jokes, as we all know. I was going to say that good Farmer Barrett's death affected me very much. He was a very great comfort to me, was Farmer Barrett. It was not only that we agreed upon most points, and thought alike in a manner most satisfactory to both of us. That was a great comfort, living as we did under the same roof, and sitting together, either in his kitchen or my parlour, almost every evening, to enjoy a quiet gossip. But there were other comforts too, and the chief one, that which I may fairly consider the principal advantage which I reaped from the society of Farmer Barrett, was derived from his extraordinary knowledge of the legends and traditions of his native country concerning witches and wizards. Many and many an evening have we sat talking upon such matters, till I have really felt quite nervous about going to bed. Not that I am a nervous man, not by any means, but I own that more than once, after discussing witches and their cats to a late hour, I have felt a curious sensation when the house cat came rubbing herself against my shins, and have looked with a species of creepy feeling over my left shoulder as I went upstairs to bed, almost thinking I should see something uncanny close behind me. I never knew that any man with such a collection of stories and legends as old Barrett. He had tales without end of the Warlock of Combe, the Wizard of Bockhanger, and the Witch of Brook Hollow. He could tell of the dark doings of the Hag of Hothfield, and the fearful creature who so long inhabited the regions of Charing, and darkened the woods of Long Beach with her awesome shadow. I do not believe that any witch or wizard ever existed in Kent whose story was not well known to Barrett. Of his own knowledge he could tell something. Once there happened a curious thing in his stables. His two teams of horses, fed alike, housed equally well, and treated with precisely the same care, strangely varied in their appearance and condition. One team were always sleek and slim, fat and well liking, like Pharaoh's fat kine, and the admiration of all beholders. The other team were just the reverse. Nothing they took seemed to agree with them, and they fell away, their bones started through their skins, and their appearance was a disgrace to the farm. This state of things greatly puzzled and annoyed the farmer and his men. Barrett himself laid the blame upon the waggoner and his mate, and threatened to discharge both of them if things went on so, as he felt sure they petted one team of horses at the expense of the other. The men earnestly denied the charge, and were evidently much vexed at its having been made. Things went on the same until, at last, the waggoner, who was a clever and withal a courageous man, determined to sit up all night and watch. He did so, being carefully hidden in the corner of the stable. The horses fed well, and lay down as usual. All was quiet until 12 o'clock struck. At that moment several little men, about a foot high, leaped down from the loft above the stables, and, going to the favoured team, began to brush and comb them with great care and energy, rubbing them well all over, and uttering no words to anybody as they did so, save to each other as they worked, as if to encourage themselves to greater exertions. "I work, you work. I work, you work," they kept saying, and the coats of the horses rapidly became more smooth and glossy, until, when the little men had finished, they were perfect models of what horses should be. They merely looked at the other team with funny faces, and then hastened up again to their loft. All this the waggoner duly told his master the next morning, and of course, with the natural incredulity of men, he at first refused to believe it. But when, upon the man again and again assuring him of its truth, he determined to put the matter to proof by hiding himself that same night, he saw precisely the same thing, and was of course convinced. I forget how the story ended, but I know that, somehow or other, he managed to get some wise person in the neighbourhood to speak up for the poor, thin team, and prevent the little elves, or whatever they were, from spiting them any more. Then the farmer had a tale which had been told him by a groom he once had in his service, who came from the hill above Charing. Up over the hill there was a reputed witch, Mrs. Dorland. I questioned the groom about this woman myself, so I may as well give the story in his own words. "She were noted a witch, she were," he said. "How do you know?" I asked, not because I myself doubted for a moment, but because I wanted to glean all the particulars I possibly could. "Bless ye, sir," replied the youth, "I knows all about it because of my grandfather. She wouldn't ever let him alone. I expect he'd affronted her, one time or other. I recollect when I was a-staying along with him once, and the door locked and all, he looked over the stairs, and there, sure enough, was old Dame Dorland on the mat at the bottom, and her eyes! Oh, they glounded in her head, they did." "But how did she get in?" I asked. "That's just what I want to know," answered the boy. "The door was shut and fast locked, but there she was anyhow. Another time my grandfather had to drive some bullocks down to Ashford Market, and he overtook Dame Dorland. She had a basket on her arm, and she asked my grandfather to carry it for her. He wouldn't. I expect he didn't know what bad game might be up. Well, do you think he could keep his bullocks in the road after that? Not he. They was over the hedge, first one side and then another, and then they was for running back. He couldn't do nothing with them, so he turns back and offers to carry the old girl's basket. Then the bullocks was all right directly, and he hadn't no trouble in getting them along all the way to Ashford. Since Farmer Barrett had lived all his life in a county where such people as Dame Dorland were to be found, there can hardly be much surprise felt at his entire and implicit belief in witchcraft. But the most wonderful tale that he ever told me was that which not only concerned the county, but the very district in which he dwelt. It is a story to which I listened with intense interest when I first heard it, and my interest was never lessened by its repetition. Again and again I asked the old farmer to go over it once more, and I cross-examined him upon all the particulars of his tale in a manner which would really have offended some people of my acquaintance. He, however, was not only not offended, but pleased at the perseverance with which I questioned him. He told me the story, in fact, so often that I got to know it nearly by heart, and I think it is one which I ought to relate for the benefit of a world in which, as far as I can see, belief of any kind, and certainly belief in witches and the like, will shortly be extinct. The parish of Mersham has long been known as a favourite resort of queer people of the kind of whom I am speaking. It is a very long, narrow parish, much narrower, of course, at some parts than others. Its north end runs into and beyond the park of Mersham Hatch, that is, the west side of the park, the east side being in the parishes of Brabourne and Smeeth. The south part of the parish joins Bilsington and Aldington, and on the southwest you are very close upon the Ruckinge and Orlestone big woods, so close that I am not sure whether a portion of that vast tract of woodland does not actually lie within the boundaries of the parish of Mersham. Be that as it may, it is a wild part of the world, and just the very sort of place in which you would fancy witches and their confederates to abound. Whether you fancy it or not, however, beyond all doubt such was the case, in the good old times of which I speak. No one ever dreamed of being out at night in those parts, if he could possibly help it. The roads were wretchedly bad, full of deep ruts and big stones, with ditches inconveniently exposed on either side, and bushes jutting out from the adjoining woods in the most awkward manner for the traveller. But it was not the badness of the roads which deterred people from moving about at night, or towards evening, but something much worse, namely, the strange and terrible beings who frequented the locality. All kinds of rumours were current with respect to witch meetings and gatherings held by wicked creatures, upon which, if a mortal man of ordinary mould happened to come, he ran a terrible risk of some dreadful misfortune happening to him and his shortly afterwards. Cottages were few and far between. There was scarce a public house to be found in the neighbourhood, save one or two which had an evil reputation as the haunt of smugglers and outlawed men. No gentleman's house was near, and Bilsington Priory had passed away with all its holy train of priests, and nothing was to be seen of their former glory, and no vestige of themselves either, unless it was true that a monk walked occasionally round the walls with ghostly tread, and moaned deeply and sadly as he compared the past with the present. In short, it was a wild, weird country, and wild, weird people dwelt there. From Aldington Knoll, right away down the other side of Ham Street, the thick woods contained a class of beings who, if they lived there nowadays, would be a horror to all Christian men, and an intolerable nuisance to the Kent County Constabulary. There were, however, honest men there, as everywhere else, and, although for the most part such people preferred to dwell nearer Mersham Street, or immediately below the church, yet the scattered cottages further south were not altogether without inmates, who, having nowhere else to live, lived there. John Gower was one of these, a respectable, middle-aged man, who won his bread by the sweat of his brow, and was proud of the name of a Kentish labourer. John had married early in life, lost his wife after the birth of their fourth child, and remained a widower ever since. Although he could neither read nor write, he was blessed with good common sense, and was able to give his children plain and sensible advice, which might serve them, he said, in as good stead as book learning, if they would only lay it to heart and act upon it. His eldest girl, Mary, was as good a girl as you would meet in a day's journey. She had her good looks, as most Mersham girls have, but she had that which is even better than good looks, an even temper and a good disposition. She was about 17 when our story begins. Her brother Jack, between 15 and 16, was away at work down in the shires, as the neighbours called all other counties but their own, and two little ones, Jane, under 14, and Billy, just 12, were at home, the former helping her sister as well as she could, and the latter doing such odd jobs as could be found for him, and doing no more mischief than a boy of his age could help. The cottage in which they lived was very near the big woods, too near to be pleasant for anyone who feared witches or wizards, and it must be confessed that John Gower was not without his fears. He had various horseshoes nailed up about his premises to keep the evil creatures off, and he carefully barred his doors and windows every night, not knowing what might happen if any of them were left open. He could tell of strange cries heard in the woods at night, and if you suggested that they might proceed from owls, he shook his head sadly and gravely as one who knew better, and grieved over your doubting spirit. But, in spite of his fears and precautions, and the strange locality in which he lived, Gower could not be called otherwise than a cheerful man. He worked all day, got home as soon as he could, was pleasant and happy with his children, of whom he was very fond, and was certainly of a contented disposition, and one who made the best of the world, and took things as he found them. Such was he, and such was his family at the time that the occurrences took place which I am about to relate. Some years before the date at which our story commences, there had lived at the extreme south of the parish of Mersham a woman of the name of Betty Bartlett. She was not only a reputed witch, but the fact of her being so was testified to by a great number of credible witnesses, who had either suffered in their own persons from her evil power, or had seen and heard things which could not have been had she been an ordinary and Christian woman. She lived to a very great age. Nobody knew exactly how old she was when she died, and although the rumours respecting her career caused the clergyman of the parish to entertain serious doubts as to the course he should pursue, she was eventually carried to Mersham churchyard to be therein interred. But if I am correctly informed, and I obtained my information from highly respectable people, there were strange and terrible doings at her funeral. She was carried on a wagon from the cottage in which she had breathed her last, as far as the bridge over the river Stour, which flows, as all the world knows, a few hundred yards south of the church. There, from some unknown cause, the horses would not cross the bridge, and it was told me that they seemed quite exhausted with the short journey, little over 3 miles, which they had performed. So the people unharnessed them from the wagon, placed all that remained of old Betty on the shoulders of 8 stout bearers, and marched forward towards the churchyard. But not only was their burden wondrously heavy, but it seemed to grow heavier as they went on, and they had the greatest difficulty in making their way up the short hill, and so round to the right towards the churchyard. And just before they got to the gate, why or wherefore nobody could tell, one of the bearers stumbled, and in doing so tripped up another, and down came the whole concern with a great crash upon the ground. Everything connected with their burden suddenly disappeared. A vast cloud of black dust arose and blew all over the place, and out of the dust flew a great black bird with a strange and awful croak, with which it terribly frightened the bystanders and bearers, as it flew off directly in the contrary direction to the churchyard. What happened immediately afterwards Farmer Barrett never heard, or at least he never told me, But nobody ever doubted that the old witch had flown off in the shape of the black, fearsome bird, being unable to enter the holy ground of the churchyard. Be this as it may, the ancient woman left behind her 3 daughters, who had all inherited their mother's wickedness, and were witches every one of them. Their actual names were Betty, Jane, and Sarah, but they were popularly known as Skinny, Bony, and Humpy, the 2 elder sisters being thin and gaunt, whilst the youngest was shorter and had a species of hump between her shoulders. Every one in Mersham, and for the matter of that, in the adjoining parishes also, knew these 3 sisters by sight, and avoided them as much as possible. No conceivable misfortune ever happened in that neighbourhood that was not attributed to their influence, and all that went wrong was immediately laid at their door. The sisters were well aware of the awe with which the neighbours regarded them, and took good care that it should not diminish, never losing an opportunity of frightening those simple people with whom they came in contact. They lived in a long, low cottage, scarcely worthy of the name of cottage, so miserable was it both as regards the outside building and the inside accommodation. The roof was of thatch, and the dwelling itself was at one end built of Kentish rag stone, but badly constructed, and all the rest of it was composed entirely of wood, and apparently afforded but poor shelter against wind and rain. The women lived mostly at the stone-built end of their house, for there was their kitchen, such as it was, but very little was known of the interior of this place, inasmuch as nobody came near it who could possibly go another way. It was situate, however, barely half a mile from John Gower's cottage, a fact which caused him and his no little annoyance, inasmuch as the 3 crones of Mersham, as they were usually called, were not the best of neighbours, and never very particular as far as other people's property was concerned. Now, John Gower had a great number of relations. In fact, there was and is an old proverb in his native parish to the effect that, if you know the Gowers, you know all Mersham, and certainly the knowledge would to this day make you acquainted with a large quantity of people. They were none of them rich relations, certainly, unless you might have applied that adjective to the wife of a certain farmer Long, who lived a few miles off, and whose husband might certainly be said to be thriving. Sally Long was a stout, comfortable-looking dame, who could not fairly have found fault if you had called her fat, but who, unlike most fat people, was not gifted with the best of tempers. If all reports were true, she led her husband rather a life of it, and scolded pretty equally all her household. She had no children, and her husband's son by a former wife, being a trifle weak in the head, and for that reason generally known by the name of Simple Steenie, there was no one to dispute her authority in the house, yard, or farm. These worthy people lived in the parish of Aldington, and although John Gower was no looker after dead men's shoes, and a man who would have scorned to bow down before any one for the sake of their wealth, he thought it was but right and fair towards his children to encourage them to maintain friendly relations with his distant cousin, Dame Long. She had noticed the children more than once, when they were quite little things, and when a woman of a certain age, with no children of her own, notices the children of other people, who happen to be her own relations, there is no telling what may come of it. So the boys had orders to take their caps off, and the girls to drop a respectful curtsey whenever they passed Mrs. Long, and any little act of civility which they could possibly perform was never forgotten. Now, it happened that someone, many years ago, had given to the Gower family a very particular cat. When I use the word particular, I do not mean to imply a very strict or fastidious cat, but one that was particular in the sense of being different from the general run of cats, which was certainly true of this individual cat. She was jet black, which you will say is not at all uncommon. But Farmer Barrett always maintained that no cats that he had ever heard of were so jet and glossy as the Gower cats. She was a magnificent animal, her whiskers unusually long, her tail splendidly bushy, her body beautifully and symmetrically made, and her head, in size, shape, and the intelligence which was displayed upon her face, little short of perfection. This cat lived until a great age, and nobody exactly knew when or where it died. To tell the truth, there was always a legend in the Gower family that it never did die, at least not in their cottage, but that it disappeared on the very day of old Betty Bartlett's death. I do not know, for Farmer Barrett could not tell me, though I asked him more than once, how they connected the two events, but nevertheless they had in this legend, if so I may call it. But whatever happened to this cat, of one thing there is certainly no doubt, namely that during her lifetime she several times went through the ceremony of kittening, and that her race seemed by no means likely to be extinct. Her kittens were always black, always very glossy, and always remarkably clever and intelligent, and people were always glad to get a kitten of the Gower breed. So when upon a fine summer's morning one of the descendants of the famous animal of which I have spoken was found by John Gower with a little family of 4 kittens around her, he and his children were not displeased at the addition to the household; and when, after a few days, one of these kittens appeared to be developing into an animal more comely and more sprightly than the rest, the worthy man thought it would be a proper and becoming compliment upon his part if he made a present of it to good Mrs. Long. So he told Mary that she should take it up in a little basket the very next day, give his duty to old Aunt Sally, for so they called her in the cottage when they spoke of her among themselves, though it was always Mrs. Long when they spoke to her, and ask her acceptance of the gift. Mary made her preparations accordingly. She could not go up to the farm in the morning, for she had the rooms to do, the house to sweep, father's dinner to get ready and carry to him, and a number of little jobs to get done which it was necessary to finish before she could feel herself at liberty to go out. At last, however, every duty seemed to have been discharged, as is always the case at some time or other, if people will only set themselves at work to do resolutely that which they have before them to do, instead of sitting down with folded hands and sighing over the prospect of it. It must have been between 3 and 4 o'clock in the afternoon when Mary found that she could get away with a clear conscience. Then she put on her little straw hat, donned her grey cloak, put the kitten in a little basket with a little hay for it to lie on, and called her brother Billy to come with her, wisely thinking this the most likely way to keep him out of mischief. It was a truly glorious afternoon, such as an English summer's afternoon often is. "Talk to me about foreign countries," as Farmer Barrett often used to say, snapping his fingers audibly. "That for you furry nearers. There ain't no land like old England to my mind, and, being myself old and prejudiced, I confess that I am very much of the good old farmer's opinion. It is very charming, no doubt, to roam through foreign lands, and there is doubtless much to admire. When I shut my eyes and muse over the beautiful views I have seen, many such come back to me with pleasing memories. I see the sparkling Rhine with castle-crowned heights, and scenery world worshipped for its very beauty. I gaze with a delight tempered with awe upon the mighty snow-clad mountains of life-breathing Switzerland. I sit upon the shores of the Sea of Seas, the Mediterranean, and I cast my eyes upon its waters of eternal blue. And most wonderful sight of all, I stand upon the plateau opposite the Cascatile at Tivoli, and with the waterfall and town on one side, Adrian's villa nestling below on the left, and the hills behind, look out over the vast Campagna with its ever-changing lights, see Rome, grand, glorious Rome, in the far distance, and feel carried out of myself, and away from all the ideas of mere earth and earthly things as I lose all individuality of being in the absorbing contemplation of a beauty so divinely sublime. And then, as the magic power of thought enables me to move faster than railroads, steamers, or electric telegraphs, I suddenly transport myself to a quiet, homely English scene upon a summer's afternoon, and I think to myself that neither the Rhine, Switzerland, nor Italy can produce anything more pleasing to the eye, more soothing to the senses, or more entirely enjoyable to any person capable of enjoyment, and not given to despise the beauties of scenery merely because they can be seen at home without hurrying off to foreign lands. Such a summer's afternoon fell on this particular day of which we are now speaking. There was hardly a breath of air, but the woods, having got their shady green dress on, kept off the heat of the sun from the traveller on the road which intersected them. It was very warm, though, and very still, and you might hear the voices of the woodland birds singing in notes which seemed somewhat subdued, as if the heat forbade the songsters to exert themselves to their full strength. But warm as it was, there was a very pleasant feeling in the air. Nature seemed to be basking in the sun and thoroughly enjoying herself. The rabbits hopped across the road as quietly as if there were no such things as weasels in the world, and keepers had never existed. The old jay flitted heavily from tree to tree, her hard note softened down to a low guttural sound. All insect life was on the move, and every living being seemed to delight in the genial weather. Of course, under these circumstances, Mary and Billy Gower did not walk very fast. On the contrary, they rather dawdled, for Billy saw now and then a butterfly, now and then a bird's nest, and was constantly tempted to leave the road and dive into the woods on either side, whilst his sister did not like to hurry on and leave him, and saw no reason for particular haste. They passed along for some way without adventure, until Aldington Knoll came into sight, although they were still in the shady lanes of their own parish. Then, on turning a corner, they came suddenly upon two figures approaching them from the opposite direction, that is to say, as if they had come from Aldington Knoll. The children needed no second glance to tell them that they were in the presence of two of the Mersham crones. Lanky and Skinny were the lovely pair whom they had the good fortune thus to meet, and the children felt by no means comfortable when they saw them. Mary, indeed, being now 17, and hardly to be deemed a child any longer, felt no babyish fear at the sight of the old woman. She was, as I have said, a good sort of girl, and one who tried to do her duty, and she had a feeling within her, as such people generally have, that as long as she did so, no great harm would be allowed to happen to her. But as for little Billy, who had occasionally been threatened, when naughty, that he should be given to the crones, he could by no means be restrained from great manifestations of fear. He trembled greatly as soon as he saw the two, clutched hold of his sister's gown, and begged her to turn back and run away, as they were still 40 or 50 yards from the old women. This, however, would have been contrary to Mary's sense of right. She had been sent by her father to perform a certain duty, and that duty, come what would, she meant to discharge, unless prevented by superior force. So she trudged on steadily along the road, and her brother accompanied her, probably because he thought it the least of two evils, and was too much terrified to run away. As they neared the two crones, they could not but feel that there was nothing either prepossessing or agreeable in the appearance of the latter. Their clothes were untidy and ill-fitting. Each had a kind of hood half drawn over her head, but not sufficiently so as to conceal her decidedly ugly figures, whilst a certain wild, haggard look, which sat upon their faces, was anything but calculated to put the traveller at his ease. They walked, or rather crawled, along one side of the road, and close behind them followed a gaunt cat, which, if formerly black, was now grey with age, and which wore upon its face the same haggard look which was so plainly discernible upon those of the hags themselves. Mary and Billy walked quietly on, and were just passing these strange beings, and really beginning to hope that they might be allowed to do so without interruption, when they were suddenly pulled up by the harsh voice of the crone nearest to them, who called out, "Stop! in a voice harsher than the croak of a raven, but with such a tone of authority that no thought of disobeying her entered the head of either of those she addressed even for a single moment. "Stop, young people!" she said a second time. "Whither away so fast this afternoon?" Mary civilly replied, "We are going up to Farmer Long's, ma'am. Father sent us." "Ah!" replied the crone, "going up to Farmer Long's for father, are ye, my chickens? Fine times, forsooth, when John Gower's children go visiting, instead of minding their business at home. But pray, what have you got in that basket, my pretty Minnikin?" "Only a kitten, ma'am, that father is going to give to Aunt Sal, to Mrs. Long," replied the girl. "Only a kitten!" cried the other crone, who had not yet spoken. "Only a kitten, indeed! And how does John Gower, the labourer, have kittens to give away, I should like to know? Our poor old Grimalkin here has lost a kitten lately. I wonder whether this can be the same, strayed over to John Gower's house. If he had a kitten to give away, he might have thought of his poor neighbours, methinks, instead of the rich farmer's wife." When Mary heard these words, she began to tremble for the safety of her kitten, for, as I have already remarked, the crones of Mersham were not famous for distinguishing clearly between other people's property and their own. So she made reply very quickly in these words: "Please, ma'am, this kitten can't be your cat's, because we've known it ever since it was born, and its mother too, and it has never been out of our charge yet." "No matter, no matter," said the crone in a testy voice. "Let me see it, and I shall soon know all about it." Mary did not dare refuse, nor would it have been much use if she had done so. The crone stretched out her long skinny hand, and lifting the basket lid, saw the little black kitten, which, immediately that it saw her, crouched down in the corner of the basket and uttered a low moaning sound. "Poor little thing!" said the old hag. "Poor little thing! I can hardly see it so. Look, Sister Jane!" And the other crone came and peered also into the basket, whilst the kitten continued to crouch and moan. "The very image of our Grimalkin! I do declare," cried the second crone after a moment, "it must be hers. There can be no doubt at all about it." So saying, she put her hand down and stroked the back of the kitten, as if about to take it out of the basket. As soon as she touched it, however, the little animal, young as it was, appeared to go into a paroxysm of fear and fury. It growled and spit, made as if it would spring out of the basket, and suddenly inflicted a severe scratch on the hand which was about to seize it. The old woman's face immediately became distorted with rage, and as she hastily withdrew her hand, she fixed her eyes steadily upon the kitten, muttering at the same time some words which the children could not understand, but which sounded in their ears like anything but a prayer. Neither of the crones, however, tried further to interfere with the kitten, but begged of the children to give them money, saying that they were nearly starving. Billy, of course, had nothing, and Mary only had a penny, but she thought it best to give that for fear of being bewitched if she refused. So, sorrowfully enough, the poor child drew out her only coin and placed it in the hand of one of the hags, who grinned frightfully by way of thanks, and allowed the children to proceed on their way, although, before they did so, they could not help noticing the strange conduct of Grimalkin, who threw herself on the side of the road, turned over and over, grinned like a Cheshire cat, and appeared to be convulsed with laughter at all that had occurred. Mary and Billy, however, glad to have got away from the old women, hurried forward towards Farmer Long's dwelling. But now the conduct of the kitten became inexplicable. Up to the time of their meeting the crones, it had behaved like a decent little animal of tender years, nestling quietly in its basket, and giving no trouble to anybody. It now took quite a different course. It moaned and whined as if it wanted to get out. It pushed against the basket, first on one side and then on the other, as if trying to force its way through, and behaved in all respects as if it were a mad kitten, Although, as I never saw a mad kitten, I am not sure how they do behave exactly. But this was Farmer Barrett's expression, and a man of his years and experience was not likely to be wrong. But more than this, although the kitten was young and small, and had therefore been very light and easy to carry, scarcely had the children passed the crones than its weight seemed to increase vastly, and it became 4 times as heavy as before, until poor Mary's arm quite ached with carrying it. Billy, seeing her trouble, advised her to turn it out into the woods, but Mary would not do this, being determined to obey her father's orders, so she trudged steadily on until they came to the farm to which they had been sent. There they asked if Mrs. Long was at home, and were presently ushered into the presence of that good lady, to whom they told the object of their visit. She received them very graciously, and expressed herself much pleased with John Gower's attention in sending her the kitten, saying that she had always desired to have one of that breed. They opened the basket, and she was going to take the creature out, when it looked her straight in the face, and she drew back her hand at once. "Lawks, child!" she said to Mary, "how the thing's eyes do shine, like live coals of fire, I do declare. I never seen such eyes in all my born days, that I never did." As she spoke, the kitten saved her the trouble of removing it from the basket by jumping out of its own accord onto the table, where it sat glowering at the party and making a low noise between a purr and a growl, until Mrs. Long brought it some milk, with which it proceeded to regale itself, and the children, having had a slice of cake each, and been duly charged with the good lady's thanks to their father, took their departure and reached the cottage without further adventure. End of Part 1 of Chapter 6 of Uncle Joe's Stories. Part 2 of Chapter 6 of Uncle Joe's Stories. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Allyson Hester. Part 2 of Chapter 6, The Crones of Mersham. Now, I verily believe that the doings of that kitten at Farmer Long's farm were of such a wonderful and unheard of character that a whole book, and a very amusing book too, might be written about them. But people did not write many books in those days, and Farmer Barrett could not recollect many particulars about this part of the story. At all events, there can be no doubt, to use his own expression, that the animal's tantrums were extraordinary. The cream was constantly devoured, and the best cream jug broken on one occasion, in order to get at it. The milk was forever being upset. The marks of dirty paws were daily to be seen on clean tablecloths, or on the counterpanes of beds just made, and in short, just wherever they ought not to be. Mrs. Long's best cap, having mysteriously disappeared one afternoon, was seen in the kitten's clutches upon the hearth-rug, a perfect wreck of a cap, and useless for ever afterwards. Then the perverse little animal appeared to entertain a strong and marked partiality for young ducks and chickens, which she ruthlessly murdered whenever she could lay her paws upon them, neglecting to touch any of the rats, upon which her energies might have been much more beneficially employed. Day by day depredations were committed, all of which were attributed to the kitten, and most of which were probably perpetuated by her. From the moment of her arrival at the farm, nothing seemed to prosper with the Longs. Everything turned out just the reverse way to that which they had hoped, and it really seemed as if some evil spell had been cast upon them. Looking calmly back upon the whole history, I have no doubt at all but that the crones had bewitched the kitten when they met the children on that memorable afternoon, and that to this must be attributed all that afterwards occurred. However this may be, it was certainly an unlucky day for the Longs when that kitten came upon their premises, and that they very soon found out. Still, people do not always put the saddle upon the right horse immediately, and they did not at first believe that the animal had anything to do with their ill luck. Mrs. Long, however, who had an eye to business, could not stand the constant inroad upon her ducks and chickens, to say nothing of the cream jug, and the loss of her cap very nearly brought matters to a climax. She might, perhaps, however, have borne it a little longer, had not an event occurred which was really beyond anybody's bearing. One morning, when the worthy couple were at breakfast, the kitten calmly jumped onto the table, seized a piece of bacon which the farmer was about to place upon his own plate, and deliberately carried it off. After this, it was quite evident she must be got rid of. No man can stand being robbed of his breakfast in such a barefaced manner, and the good farmer spoke up pretty strongly on the subject. As the breed was supposed to be a particularly good one, he did not order the animal to be killed, nor indeed would he have ventured to do so unless his wife had especially wished it, but he expressed himself in forcible terms as to the desirability of its quitting his premises with as little delay as possible. Mrs. Long had by this time become so entirely of the same opinion that she resolved to take immediate steps to carry out the joint views of her husband and herself. She accordingly directed that the cart should be got ready the same afternoon, and that Tom the bailiff should drive her down to Mersham, where she determined to restore the kitten to the Gowers with her own hands. Accordingly, at the appointed time the cart was brought round. Old Dapple, the steady pony, was in it, and Tom prepared to drive. Mrs. Long got in, and the kitten, who had shown an unwonted and marvellous docility in submitting to be placed once more in a basket, was safely deposited in her lap. Off they went, out of the farmyard into the lane, and taking a turn which brought them near to Aldington Knoll, descended towards the woods through which runs the road from Mersham and Aldington to the canal, and so away across Romney Marsh to Dymchurch. You must understand that Tom and his mistress were heading away from the canal, only they had come into that road in order to reach the lower part of Mersham, in which was situate John Gower's cottage. So when they came past Aldington Knoll and descended the hill, the marsh road led back to the left, nearly parallel with that from which they came, whilst they pushed straight forward along the road through the woods. As soon as they got well into the wood, or rather into the road on each side of which the wood was wide and thick, old Dapple began to show visible signs of uneasiness. He swerved first on one side of the road, and then on the other, abandoning all the good quiet habits of a respectable middle-aged pony, and behaving much more like a giddy young colt who had never been broken to harness. Tom, the bailiff, who was a simple country lout, did not know what to make of it, and was both confused and frightened when his mistress began to tell him that it was only his bad driving. But this was evidently not the case. Dapple wanted very little driving at all, and the best whip in the world could not have kept him straight when he was in the mood which seemed now to have possessed him. Another cause also disquieted good Miss Long. The kitten began to fidget in her basket in a most unaccountable way, and to give vent to various discordant sounds, whilst the weight upon the good lady's knees, as the basket had been on Mary's arm, was really unpleasantly heavy. They managed to get through the wood somehow or other, until they were well out of the parish of Aldington, and had entered that of Mersham. Here all their troubles increased. The kitten's struggles were more violent than before, and Dapple became perfectly unmanageable, until all at once they perceived a large black cat upon one side of the road, which suddenly darted in front of the cart, and so startled the pony that he shied quite across the road, brought the wheel of the cart over the side of the ditch, and in another moment it was overset, and its occupants were tumbled into the brambles and bushes with which the ditch was choked. Had it been winter, or had there been much rain lately, poor Mrs. Long would probably have been drowned, or at best would only have escaped with a severe ducking. As it was, the principal risk of life or limb she ran was from the kicking of the pony, and as Dapple was too fat to indulge in any great manifestations of this kind, she was tolerably safe from personal injury. but a stout woman overturned in a ditch full of brambles is, after all, a pitiable object, and is not likely to be improved either in temper or in appearance by the event. So as soon as the good lady could scramble up to a sitting position, she began to abuse everybody and everything to the best of her ability, which was not inconsiderable when applied to such an attempt. She told Tom that he should certainly get the sack as soon as they got home. She declared Dapple was old and worn out, and only fit to draw the dung cart in the future, and she abused the kitten in no measured terms. But where was the kitten? In the tumble and scrimmage the lid of the basket had come off, and the animal had disappeared. Disappeared, however, only for a moment, for Tom the bailiff suddenly exclaimed in a terrified voice, "Lookee, missus, do lookee now, there be our kitten surely." And casting up her eyes, Mrs. Long beheld, or at least so she always declared to her dying day, the kitten seated upon the back of the large black cat which had been the cause of their disaster, and which was now careening full tilt down the road with this rider upon it. The old lady, being brave as she was stout, which is saying a great deal, felt nothing but rage when she saw what had happened, not only at the impudence of the cat, but because this occurrence threw a light upon the past, and at once opened her eyes to the truth and disclosed the reason of the kitten's abominable behaviour at the farm. After a moment's pause, she broke out in great wrath. "It's them crones!" she cried in loud and excited tones. "It's them crones, or some like 'em! That kitten's been bewitched! That's what come to it, Tom, you may depend upon it. Drat them witches!" Scarcely were the words out of her mouth when she shrieked loudly, "Ah!" "What's the matter, missus?" said Tom. "Why," replied she, "something scratched me," and pointing to her arm, the sleeve around which had been pushed up high in her struggles to sit upright, there indeed was a long red scratch, as if inflicted by the nail of a hand or the claw of an angry cat. To be sure, a lady who is seated in the middle of a bed of brambles cannot be expected to escape unscratched, and no supernatural agency need be invoked in order to produce such a misfortune. Still, Mrs. Long always declared that this was no bramble scratch, and coming as it did at the very moment when she was speaking strongly against the witches, there could be very little doubt as to the source from which the injury really came. However, witches or no witches, it was impossible to sit all the livelong afternoon in a ditch full of brambles, so with much difficulty and many struggles, Mrs. Long contrived to get up, and Tom the bailiff, having looked to Dapple, found there was no very serious damage done either to him or to the cart, so they righted the latter, and having got into it, proceeded on their journey. True it was that there was now no kitten to take back to the Gowers, but the farmer's wife was determined to let them know the extraordinary manner in which the animal had conducted itself, and had a great dislike to turning back without reaching the place for which she had started. So she directed Tom to drive on along the crossroad which leads from Aldington Woods to Bilsington, and comes out into the main road from Mersham to Romney Marsh. At that point, if you turn to the left, you can go to the marsh, or to Rucknage and Orlestone by a road which lies a little further south, and if you turn to the right, you pass through the end of the great range of woods which occupies so much of that district, and presently come from Bilsington and to Mersham. Of course, it was to the right that Mrs. Long turned, having made a kind of half circle round Bilsington Priory, which was thus at her right hand all the time. It is necessary to be thus particular, in order that no innocent parish may be wrongfully suspected of having harboured the strange and wicked creatures whose power was almost entirely confined to parts of Mersham, Bilsington, and Aldington, and some parishes further west on the borders of the marsh. A good name is a great possession, and the adjacent parishes of Sevington, Hinkshill, Smeeth, and Sellinge have always been so free from the worst class of witches that, in writing of this neighbourhood, one wishes to be precise. After they had turned to the right, as I say, a short mile brought our travellers to John Gower's cottage, but before they reached it, they had to pass within 100 yards or so of the abode of the crones, to which a very little frequented by-road led, branching off from the road on which they were driving. It showed courage in Mrs. Long to take this route, especially after what had happened, but she was naturally a bold woman, and perhaps she thought that the witches had probably done all that they cared to do in having overturned her cart once and stolen her kitten. Be this as it may, she reckoned without her host, for Dapple, who had been quiet enough since the accident, began to grow restive again as they neared the part of the road which I have mentioned, and, when within 50 yards of it, suddenly stopped and refused to move an inch. Tom the bailiff laid the whip over the pony's back with a will, but the only effect was to make him rear and back, so that they were in imminent danger of a disaster similar to the first. Then, to make matters worse, there arose a cloud of fog before them, which was so thick they could see nothing, and had a disagreeable smell of smoke about it. Whence or wherefore it came, they could not tell, for the sun was still high in the heavens, and the sky above their heads clear and blue. It was evident that something evil was at hand and at work, and neither Mrs. Long nor her servant knew what to make of it. Presently the good lady called out angrily, "How dare you pinch my arm, Tom?" and gave a short, sharp scream as she said so. "Oh, don't! Please don't, missus!" cried the man at the same moment, as a hand hit him a cruel box on the ear. It need scarcely be said that neither of the occupants of the cart had touched the other, but the matter did not end there. Pinches, pushes, scratches, thumps, hair-pulling, and kicking began to a most extraordinary extent. No one could be seen, but invisible hands assailed both Mrs. Long and Tom so fiercely and so vigorously that they both shouted aloud with pain and terror, whilst, as if in answer to their cries, hoarse chuckles and deep bursts of laughter rang in their astonished ears, although no human being of any description was to be seen. Never was there a more unpleasant experience than that which the worthy pair underwent, and how it would have ended I really cannot say, but for an unlooked for and fortunate event. All of a sudden the pinching and beating ceased, the laughter came to an end, and the fog or cloud disappeared as it had come, by magic, as a cheery voice shouted out, close at hand, "Hallo! Who is this making such a noise in the road? My good people, it is too bad that you should let drink get the better of you in this way." Glancing indignantly round, they beheld no less a person than the worthy rector of Mersham himself, riding upon a stout grey cob, and evidently coming home from some expedition to the further extremity of his parish. Mrs. Long knew not what reply to make, but as soon as she recovered herself sufficiently, she answered the appeal. "I am sure, sir, there is no call to say a word about drink, to which some folk lays everything that happens, be it what it will, but if you'd keep your parish clear of these here witches, you'd find things go a good deal better." The clergyman gravely shook his head. "You must know, my good woman," he replied, "that there are no such beings as witches, and you ought not to wrong elderly and respectable females by using such terms. There is nobody here, and nothing to hinder your journey. I am quite ashamed to see you stopping your cart in the middle of the road and quarrelling as has evidently been the case. Take my advice and get home as fast as you can." So saying, the good man passed the cart and began to trot gently on. Dapple, as if his difficulties were suddenly over and his objections to advance removed, immediately started after the rector's cob, and thus they passed the dreaded by-road without further trouble. But, to her dying day, Mrs. Long always declared that she was sure they never would have got past if the rector hadn't come along just when he did. This shows the great and proper respect for the clergy which then existed, and is, moreover, a proof that Mrs. Long was a decent and respectable woman, whose word may be taken as establishing beyond doubt of the truth of the events which I have undertaken to relate. But it lay heavy on her soul for many a long day that the reverend man should have thought she had been drinking, and made her more than ever angry with the crones whose wicked dealings had caused such an imputation to rest upon her. The rector had trotted briskly on, and was before long out of sight, but the cart was soon close to John Gower's cottage, between which and the road was a bit of waste land. It might be as much as 2 or 3 perches in size, for in those days every strip of land was not enclosed as it is nowadays, but there were plenty of green patches by the side of the roads, and in many places you could ride on grass for miles together. It is very different now, and although it may be said on one hand that we travel faster, witches are not heard of, and England is richer than in those days, yet I often say to Jack Barrett that I think there were a good many pleasant things in the old times, especially in country life, which we do not get now, and for my part I should not mind having them back again, even with a few witches here and there with them, provided we could get rid of some of the strange new-fangled ideas and curious goings-on which we have got instead, and which are much worse for all of us than a witch or two, or even a stray wizard. Well, Mrs. Long told Tom the bailiff to drive upon this bit of waste as near to the garden gate of John Gower's cottage as he could manage to get, and then down she scrambled and went into the house. John had not yet come home from his work, though he was expected every moment, but Mary received her guest with much civility, for she was a good-mannered girl, and knew how to behave to her betters. So she did the honours of the house, whilst her sister and Billy sat still and listened. Mrs. Long was, as you may suppose, not exactly in the best of humours, nor was her dress in precisely that condition in which ladies like their dresses to be when they go out visiting. You cannot be overturned into a ditch, scratched, pinched, hustled, and pushed without some little disarrangement of your attire, and Mrs. Long's dress consequently required a good deal of putting tidy, in which Mary Gower assisted her to the best of her ability. Whilst doing so, she listened to the account of all that had occurred since the day upon which she and Billy had left the kitten at the farm, and upon being questioned by Mrs. Long as to the possible cause of its behaviour, she told her of their having met the 2 crones as I have described. The farmer's wife then said that had she known the circumstance, she would have had nothing to do with the kitten, but that she did not blame Mary for not having told her, as of course she had not suspected there was anything wrong with the animal. As she spoke, in came John Gower from his work, and to him the whole story was soon told. John expressed his great regret at what had happened, and went so far as to offer the farmer's wife another kitten, but, under the circumstances, she deemed it better to decline the offer, and presently afterwards departed, taking good care to avoid the road by which she had come, and turning up instead by the road, at the corner of which the Good Intent public house now stands, by which means she kept to the north of the big woods, and got safely home. Her adventure, however, made no little talk in the neighbourhood, and people shook their heads, gravely and wisely, whenever the matter was mentioned. Mrs. Long herself was so angry at the disrespectful manner in which she had been treated, and the unjust suspicion that had been raised in the clergyman's breast, that she could by no means be satisfied to rest quiet. Before taking any steps, however, to get matters set right, she determined to make an expedition to Brabourne, where lived a wise woman named Goody Flasket, for whom she obtained sundry charms against witchcraft, with which she decorated herself, in order that she might be able to speak and act against witches with impunity. Thus armed, she never lost an opportunity of doing both the one and the other, and I suppose the charms must have had a certain power, because Farmer Barrett declared that the good woman, when she had them on, never felt any of those strange scratches from invisible hands which she had experienced when speaking against witches on the occasion already mentioned. Still, say and do what she would, the power of the Mersham crones did not seem to be diminished. They seldom appeared all 3 together, but might be said generally to hunt in couples, although sometimes they were met singly, but hardly ever without a great black cat. The kitten was never again seen by its former owners, but in all probability had been taken by the crones to form one of the guardian cats by which they were thus attended. Petty thefts abounded in the neighbourhood, and no one suffered from them more than Farmer Long, although his farm was at a considerable distance from the cottage of the crones. At last things got so bad that the farmer really thought he could stand it no longer. So one day, after the disappearance of a fine lamb from one of his fields, when the crone Humpy had shortly before been seen in the immediate proximity of the flock, and one man went so far as to say he had seen her driving a lamb before her in the road, the farmer boldly applied to the nearest justice of the peace for a warrant to search the cottage. There was some little difficulty in the matter, owing to the circumstance that old Finn, the Mersham constable, positively declined for some time to go near the place, but upon being encouraged by the parish constable of Smeeth, bold Joe Worrell, who offered to go with him, they proceeded to perform their duty, accompanied by the farmer. Mrs. Long had gone to Dymchurch that day for a breath of sea air, so that he knew she would not be uneasy about him, and deemed it but right to back up the officers of justice, whom he met by appointment at the foot of Collier's Hill in Mersham, and they advanced together. But the road appeared to be endless, for although it could not be much more than 2 miles, if so much, to the cottage, it seemed as if they would never get there. Then, although the weather had been fine, there came on a hailstorm which nearly blinded them, and, notwithstanding that Finn had been born in the parish, and the others knew it well, they actually lost their way, and found themselves close to King's North Church, which everybody knows to be in quite an opposite direction. They hastily retraced their steps, but then it suddenly became dark. Finn and the farmer both had their hats plucked off their heads by invisible hands, and although Worrell was untouched, it being well known that no witch dare lay hands on a Smeeth man, yet he felt far from comfortable. Determined, however, to do their duty, the men made another attempt, and going round towards Aldington, were about to try and approach that side, when all darkness having cleared away, they saw at a distance a light in the sky, which betokened a fire, and from the direction it appeared to be burning somewhere very near to Farmer Long's house. This put out of his head altogether the business upon which he was out, and he immediately retraced his steps as fast as possible, accompanied by the constables. When he got near home, the flames seemed to have died away, but a heavy smoke hung over the place, and as he approached still nearer, a sad sight indeed met his eyes. His stables were utterly burned to the ground, and 3 valuable horses destroyed, despite every effort to save them. Farmer Long rushed hastily to the spot, but all he found was his poor half-witted son sitting calmly on the grass, contemplating the smouldering embers with a vacant expression of countenance. "What has happened, Stephen lad? Where's Tom? How did all this begin? Who has done it?" were the eager questions of the excited man. But to all of them the youth replied with the stolid indifference of idiocy, "Steenie not know." Subsequent inquiries proved that 2, as usual, of the crones had been seen in the vicinity of the farm that day. As a public road ran very near, this may perhaps be deemed by some to have been slight and inconclusive evidence of guilt, but it was universally accepted at the time as beyond all doubt connecting them with the affair. Some few there were who insinuated that the idiot boy had set the stable on fire for amusement, unconscious of the mischief he was doing. But these, of course, were some of the foolish and obstinate people who always like to differ from the rest of the world, and put forward their own views against those of everybody else. Of course it was the Mersham clones who had done the thing, else why should it have occurred at the very time when Farmer Long was engaged on an expedition, the object of which was to search their cottage? At all events, so entirely convinced upon the subject was the whole neighbourhood, that it resolved the matter could not rest there, but must be taken up seriously. The question was, how to do it? Inquiry before the magistrates appeared useless, for if 2 constables, and one of them a Smeeth man too, could not even approach the crone's dwelling, Of what avail was it to invoke the authority of the law? The church might be tried, but the rector of Mersham was known to have steadily set his face against any belief in witches, and it was more than probable that no other clergyman would like to interfere in his parish without his knowledge and consent. Long consultations were held, and wise heads laid together about the business, and at last it was determined to rouse the honest people of the neighbourhood round, most of whom had suffered more or less from the pilfering habits of the crones, and, covered with as many charms and magic tokens as they could obtain from old Goody Flasket and one or two other wise women who lived near the place, to advance in great numbers against the enemy, in order to try what ducking in a horse pond would do for them. So, on one fine afternoon, a great concourse of people, meeting in several parties, bore down from different quarters upon the cottage of the crones. It was a mellow day in autumn, and hopping was just over at the time when this proceeding took place. John Gower had come home that day to dinner, and a memorable day it was in his family. Mary, Jane, and Billy were all at home, and they had just sat down to their homely meal when a low, hurried knocking was heard at the door. At this very moment it so happened that the horseshoe which was usually nailed over that door had fallen down, owing to one of the nails which supported it having given way, and consequently it lay on the grass near the door, instead of hanging in its usual place. Farmer Barrett was always particular in mentioning this circumstance, else, he said, people might think that a horseshoe is not a real protection against witches, whereas it is the best and surest safeguard, only it must be nailed up against a wall or over a door. John bade his son open the door, and as soon as he had done so, they perceived a good-looking young woman leading two others, apparently older than herself, but perfectly blind, whilst on her arm each carried a basket. They were quite strangers to John and his family, and appeared to have walked some way. "Might we ask to rest a while in your cottage, good friend?" asked the young woman. "I and my two blind sisters have walked all the way from Ashford to-day, and are bound to Romney." "Certainly, ma'am," said John in reply, "but surely this be a long walk for such as ye." "Ah," replied the other, "we should have thought so once, but a cruel landlord has turned us out of our house, these poor afflicted creatures and me, and having relations at Romney, we are going there in the only way the poor can travel, on our feet, and we have nothing with us but our tame rabbits, poor creatures, which we always carry in our baskets. We should be very thankful if we might come in a couple of hours or so." "By all means," said worthy John, whose simple heart was at once touched by this tale. Come in, by all means." And stepping forward, he helped one of the blind girls over the threshold, and they all entered the cottage. The moment they were inside, Mary's favourite cat, who had been seated by the fireside, intently watching the proceeding, jumped up and sprang through the open window without saying a word to anybody, which indeed, as a respectable but ordinary cat, she was not likely to have done under any circumstances. Mary observed this, and wondered at the animal being so shy of strangers, but nobody made any remark upon the incident, and seats being found for the newcomers, they not only sat down, but condescended to share the family dinner, and that with such appetites that the children of the house themselves came off but second best. John Gower asked several questions which were satisfactorily answered, but he always said afterwards that he never felt quite at home with his visitors, which he put down to their being better educated and of a position apparently somewhat above his own. As they sat and ate and talked, a distant shout was heard, and then another. "Father, what's that?" asked Billy. "Oh," replied Gower, "I expect it's the people out after the crones. I forgot all about it, not being a busy man in such matters, or I ought to help my neighbours, perhaps, for those old women are no better than they should be. Oh dear!" And whilst the words were still in his mouth, John Gower jumped up and began to hop about the room upon one leg, having been suddenly seized, he said, with a violent fit of a cramp therein. "What are they going to do with the crones, father?" asked Billy. "Duck 'em, I expect, boy," replied he, upon which the lad rejoined, "Oh, what fun! How I should like to see it!" and almost immediately afterwards burst out crying, saying that he had such a bad pain come in his inside. Meanwhile more shouting was heard, and not very far off, and presently the door was thrown open, and in came a neighbour, James Firminger by name, and a noted enemy to witches, besides being so worthy and well thought of a man that he had more than once been spoken of as fit to be parish churchwarden. "Neighbour Gower," he shouted as he came in, "why art not out with the rest of us after the crones? 'Twill be a grand day for Mersham if we get quit of them. But you've got company, I see. Bless us, what a smell of sulphur!" As he spoke, he turned his eyes on the young woman and her two blind companions, and started as he did so. Firminger never went without some potent witch charm upon him, which at once protected him from the malice of such creatures, and enabled him to detect them when disguised, and upon this occasion he had nothing less than a relic of the great Kentish saint, Thomas A. Becket, being a small piece of the hair shirt of that holy man, cut off shortly after his death by one of the monks of Canterbury, who happened to be a Firminger, and religiously preserved in the Firminger family ever afterwards. Naturally, as Farmer Barrett observed, no witch could stand against that, and Firminger was a lucky man to possess it. It was doubtless in consequence, and by the virtue of this relic, that as soon as the good man was well inside the cottage, he not only smelt the sulphur which had not been smelt by the family, but saw what was the real character of John Gower's visitors. He took no second look, but shouted aloud, "The crones! The crones!" and seizing the little case in which was his relic in his hands, displayed it openly before them. The effect was instantaneous. All beauty disappeared from the face of the young woman, her form changed, her countenance shrivelled, and she stood confessed before the party as Humpy, the youngest of the three crones of Mersham. No less sudden and complete was the alteration in her two companions, who recovered their sight at once, but together therewith resumed the unpleasant forms and features of Skinny and Bony, the two other sisters of this disreputable family. There was a visible agitation at the same moment in the baskets which the sisters had carried upon their arms, and which they had deposited on the floor upon taking their seats. The lids shook, the baskets quivered, and in another instant overturned, when out sprang three enormous black cats upon the floor of the room. With a yell which seemed to burst simultaneously from the throats of all the crones and all the cats, they rushed out the door, flying from the charm which James Firminger kept earnestly shaking before their eyes. Out of the door, over the green space in front of the cottage, into the road, and as far and fast as they could to get away from the object of their terror. John Gower and his children sat stupefied with mingled surprise and awe for some seconds, and then, jumping from their seats, they all rushed through the door after Firminger, who, having done so, stood still outside, eagerly gazing after the retreating crones. He knew well enough that, if naught had prevented them, the honest people who were out after the witches would by this time have attacked and harried their home. Whither then would they fly? If they had quitted their cottage ignorant of the coming of their enemies, and only bent on paying John Gower a visit, doubtless intending to do him some mischief or other, it might be that they would hurry home and encounter the angry mob of people, in which case there would be wild work one way or the other. If, however, as was more probable, and as was generally believed to be the case when the matter was considered afterwards, the three crones had been well aware of the projected attack upon them, and had purposely left home, hoping that they might lie safely hid in the abode of so honest and quiet a man as Gower until the danger was over, then it became a serious question as to what other refuge they would seek, now that they had been so manfully driven from their intended place of safety. The doubts of the lookers-on, however, were soon solved. A strange thing happened, which would never have been believed in those days, but that Firminger and Gower both solemnly declared it, and which perhaps actually will not be believed in these days of doubt and want of faith, but which I must nevertheless relate as Farmer Barrett told it to me. As soon as they were well on the other side of the road, each crone jumped upon her cat, and the animals, lightly springing over the hedge into the next field, set off full gallop in easterly direction, or in other words, heading as straight as a line to Aldington Knoll, well known in those good old days as the great fortress of witches. That was their point, no doubt, and it looked very much as if they were going to give up Mersham as a bad job, and betake themselves to other and safer quarters. As soon as Firminger saw the line which the crones took, he turned to Gower and said in a hasty tone, "Come on, mate, this must be seen to at once. Let us join the chaps who are gone to the old cottage as fast as we can, and tell them what we have seen, and all that has happened." John Gower was too wise a man to hesitate. Had he done so, he knew well enough that he would be suspected of having knowingly harboured the crones, and of being in league with them, a suspicion which would have ruined him for ever in his native parish, and probably driven him from the county. So he bade Mary mind the horse, and keep Jane and Billy at home, and then he set off at best pace with Firminger down the road in the direction of the cottage of the crones. They very soon reached it, and found it surrounded by a number of people, who were engaged in demolishing the premises altogether. They had not found much, probably because there was not much to find, and the owners of the place, as we know, had taken themselves off before the arrival of their unwelcome visitors. But they broke everything they could find, tore down the thatched roof to search for magic charms, none of which they found, but only a number of mice and a great deal of dust. They pulled to pieces the wooden part of the cottage, and knocked down a great part of the stone corner, counting everything as fair game, as witches' property, and striving their utmost to destroy as much as they possibly could. There were more than a couple hundred people, all told, Farmer Barrett believed, and he gave me a great many names, but I forget most of them. There was Bully Robus, of the Farrier's Arms, I know, and little Dick Broadfoot, the tailor of Mersham Street, and Bill Parsons, all the way from Warehorn Green. There were the Gowers, the Ferences, the Sillyborns, the Swafflers, Swinards, and Finns. In short, not a family in that or any of the other parishes which was not represented, and they all seemed to vie with each other, which should do the most mischief, and be foremost in pulling down and destroying the evil place. It was several minutes before James Firminger and John Gower could command the attention of people so eagerly occupied about their business as these witch seekers, and it would have been still longer, but for the position and character of Firminger, and his known hatred of all that pertained to witchcraft. He presently succeeded in making them listen to the wonders he had to relate, and when they knew for certain what had happened and the direction which the crones had taken, the whole current of their thoughts was turned into one eager desire to follow, and, if possible, to make an end of the inmates of that awful cottage as well as of the abode itself. They lost no time, therefore, in finishing the work on which they were then engaged, and immediately afterwards the whole party swarmed up the road in the direction of Aldington Knoll, keeping up each other's courage by many brave words, and shouting uncomplimentary epithets with regard to the three crones. So they pushed on until they came to the spot where four roads met: one, that which our party had traversed in walking from the cottage; another bearing back to Bilsington and Ruckinge; a third to Newchurch and the Marsh; and the fourth to Aldington Knoll. Down this last road the people turned, and then, immediately before them, they had the mass of wood upon the side of the hill, which then, as now, encompassed the knoll itself upon the north, west, and south, the ground to the east being somewhat less woody. The knoll, apparently a grass hill, only that the grass being a good deal worn away, showed the bare rock at several places, peered over the woods, and the road to it lay right through the latter for some distance, until by turning into the gate upon your right hand you entered the field out of which the knoll rose, and from the higher points of which were magnificent views over the marsh and all the country east, west, and south, the hills behind shutting out the view to the north. The people were now some 3/4 of a mile from this gate, and if truth be known, I have no doubt whatever that some of them would very gladly have been a great deal further off. The power of the crones themselves was so well known, and their reputation of Aldington Knoll was so bad, that no one felt sure that some terrible misfortune might not result from braving this one and attacking the other. They had all heard strange tales of people bewitched, changed into animals, losing their senses, and all kinds of other disagreeable things, and of course such tales would recur to them at such a moment. But there were brave hearts, then as now, among the men of Kent, and although fears and doubts may have been there, they did not operate so as to turn any man back from the work he had undertaken. The people moved down the road towards Aldington, and reached the point at which the woods began. At that moment a loud clap of thunder pealed through the air, and vivid lightning flashed across the sky. A shudder passed through many a stout frame, but the men pushed boldly on. Then came a severe hailstorm, so severe that people took shelter beneath the trees, and waited until its violence seemed to be past, but none turned back. Then came a bitter, chilling wind, though it had been a lovely, soft, mellow day. The wind cut through the trees with a moaning sound, and pierced the people like a midwinter blast. Still they pressed on, knowing that witchcraft was at work, and that retreat would be ruin. They were half way between the point at which the road entered the woods and the gate before mentioned, when a loud, terrible roaring was heard upon the right from the woods which stretched up close to the knoll itself. So strange and so dreadful was the sound, that it made the blood of those who heard it run cold, and for a moment the foremost men of the throng paused. But 3 men there were in that crowd who neither quailed nor paused for a moment, so resolutely determined were they to carry out the work they had commenced that day. These men were James Firminger, Farmer Long, and old David Finn, the parish clerk of Mersham. The last named knew but little of the crones or witches, but tradition said that there always must be a Finn for parish clerk, and that Mersham would not be Mersham without one. This being the case, the old man felt it to be his duty to take such prominent part in an affair like the present as became one of an ancient family filling a hereditary office. Therefore, although he knew that the rector would most likely have disapproved of the step he was taking, he had started early that day, and in company with Bully Robus and sundry other notables of the parish, had taken an active part in the proceedings from the beginning. These 3 men, then, were not deterred by the roaring, though it much resembled that of wild and savage beasts desiring their prey, and seeing it before their eyes. And when no beasts appeared, and it seemed to be nothing but sound, the rest of the people regained their courage, and all continued to push on towards the gate into the knoll field. About 100 yards before they reached it, however, they found that they had to encounter an unexpected obstacle in the shape of several enormous elms which lay stretched across the road in such a manner as to most effectually bar any further progress. But, to the astonishment of all, no sooner had Firminger, Long, and Finn, who were now recognized as the leaders of the expedition, approached close to the barrier, than it vanished as suddenly as it had appeared, and left the roadway free. Encouraged by this result, as unexpected as it was satisfactory, the party advanced a few yards farther, to find a great ditch yawning in front of them, and evidently intended to stop their further advance. On seeing this, Finn rushed to the front, and standing close to the edge of the abyss, pronounced in a loud voice the word "Amen," which he had long held to be the most sacred and powerful form of invocation known to the world, and one which never failed to repel any evil creature to whom it was addressed. Whether from the effects of his utterance, or from any other reason, I cannot say, but certain it is that as the worthy clerk put one leg forward as if to step into the ditch, it closed up as if it had never been dug, which perhaps was the case. At all events, whether it was a real ditch or only a delusion of the eye, the chasm disappeared altogether, and once more the party proceeded until they reached the gate of the field, and faced it, about to enter and approach the knoll, which now lay upon their right, the field in which it was situated stretching back into the woods. On entering the gate, they were at once struck by the novel and curious appearance of the knoll. Smoke appeared to envelop it on all sides, and a deep rumbling proceeded from within it, as if a volcano were at work, and a volcano that meant mischief too. The party paused for a moment, looked at each other, and then at the knoll, began to wonder what they had better do next. Everybody thought that everybody else was stopping quite unnecessarily, but nobody seemed inclined to move on first. Even the three bold men, Firminger, Long, and Finn, seemed less eager than hitherto, and whispered to each other in low, mysterious tones that they fancied they saw dark and fearful figures moving about among the smoke in which the knoll was enveloped. It was well known to these men, and indeed to most or all of their companions, that Aldington Knoll was reputed to be the abode and principal gathering place of all the evil creatures in that part of the country. By common consent, men had for a long time past shunned it as a haunted and wicked spot, and it was no common evidence of courage that so many men had been found to approach it upon this occasion. After a few moments, the three men recollected the responsibility of their position, and the absolute certainty that if their party returned home defeated, the neighbourhood would thenceforward be worse off than ever. The crones would never forget the plunder and destruction of their cottage, and would doubtless exact a severe compensation from the perpetrators of that ruthless deed. Moreover, for a couple of hundred people to have it said that they had been circumvented and beaten by three old women was not a thing to be thought of. So, shame overcoming their reluctance, they boldly marched forward again, and encouraged their followers to charge up to the very foot of the knoll. They had got quite close to it when, either by accident or because he pulled it too hard in his nervous fidgeting with it, the string by which James Firminger's relic was tied around his neck suddenly broke, and the charm itself fell to the ground. Hardly had this occurred when a yell, most discordant in its tone, but appearing to express a mingled feeling of joy, triumph, fury, and revengeful longing all in one, broke from the interior of the mount. The next instant the knoll itself opened wide, just like the mouth of a man preparing for a tremendous yawn, and a whole volley of cinders and ashes came bursting over the approaching party in a most disconcerting and unpleasant manner. At the same time, strange and uncouth figures suddenly appeared issuing from the knoll, some with goats' heads and horns, others with the bodies of men but a pig's head, snout, and bristles, others like monkeys, but oh, such frightful monkeys as never were seen, and all with eyes that rolled fearfully in their heads and glittered like fire. Conspicuous among this awful band appeared the figures of the three crones, Bony, Skinny, and Humpy, each carrying a broomstick in her hand, and followed by her cat, which bounded forward as if to attack the invaders of the haunted hill. This was more than the latter could stand. They wavered, looked around, tottered a step or two backward, and then, as the cinders, hot cinders too, came upon them, and the evil creatures almost touched them, they turned round with one accord, and fled down from the knoll as fast as their legs would carry them. Farmer Long was the first of the three leaders who gave way, for he afterwards declared that he recognized the lost kitten in a cat which seemed to select him as her particular object of attack, and as he ran, he vowed that he felt a scratch which penetrated, sharp and deep, in such a manner that he could not sit down comfortably for a fortnight, and felt perfectly sure that only the claws of that kitten could or would have dealt him such a wound. As for Finn, he so lost his head that he ran off, bawling out "Amen" continuously at the top of his voice, but in a tone which conveyed so little of the real importance and dignity attaching to the word, that it is little wonder that it had no effect. James Firminger, as became a man of his character and position, stood his ground longest, but his charm being gone, he felt less confidence, and when he, too, turned and ran, he felt belaboured by an invisible stick all the way down to the gate of the field. Shouts, shrieks, and yells of laughter followed the retreating party, and there was scarcely a man in whose breast, amid all his fears, the thought did not arise that the result of this day's work had turned out to be one so utterly unfortunate for the people, and so triumphant for the crones, that the neighbourhood would have to submit to the witch-ridden for ever after. But sometimes, in human affairs, whether those of an individual or a community, at the very moment when things seem to be at their worst, they begin to mend, and that amendment is not unfrequently brought about by some agent which, to the wise and knowing of mankind, would have appeared the most insignificant and the most unlikely to have effected the change. So it was in the present instance. The affrighted people came rushing through the gate, and avoiding the road through the wood, which was their natural way home, turned in an easterly direction and ran up the road leading away from the woods, and into the main road leading from Aldington Corner to Hythe. They had run but a very short distance when they came upon the innocent, simple Steenie Long, sitting on the bank of the road side, apparently looking for flowers. He looked up with a vacant expression upon his face, which, I am told, was not unusual with idiots in those days, and seemed astonished to see so many people all running in such a hurry. Several of the party hurried past the boy, too much occupied about providing for their own safety to think of either him or of anybody else. Presently, however, Farmer Long came running by, already somewhat out of breath, and burning with rage and shame at having been unable to resist the impulse which had made him fly before the power of the evil creatures of the knoll. When he came to the place where his son was sitting, he stopped short in his flight, and seizing the boy by the arm, hastily exclaimed, "Come along, lad, come along, this is no place for the likes of you," endeavouring at the same time to hurry the youth away with him. But simple Steenie was by no means of the same opinion. He drew himself away from his father's hold, opened his large blue eyes to their fullest extent, and observed in a calm but very decided tone, "Steenie not." "Not what, boy?" said the farmer eagerly. "You'd better not stop here, anyhow, leastways if you do, the witches will have you." But the boy, who had by this time risen to his feet, only smiled pleasantly upon his father, with the simple smile of the weak of intellect, and answered in a gentle tone, "Steenie not 'fraid, people run, Steenie not run." At this moment up came James Firminger, already bitterly repenting the flight which seemed certain to lead to such disastrous consequences. Overhearing the words of the boy, the thought instantly struck him that they might be turned to good account. Well did stout Firminger know that whatever be the power of witches and warlocks, it has no effect upon those whom Heaven has deprived of their full share of reason and intellect, and it occurred to him, and perhaps it was true, that this unexpected meeting with simple Steenie was not accidental, but that it was possibly so ordered that the victory of the evil ones might be prevented. He stopped instantly, and shouted aloud to the rest of the party. "Mates," he cried, "are we not shamed by the words of this innocent? He will not run. He! Why then should we do so? The power which protects him can protect us. Let us turn once more, and never give way like this to the evil ones." The words of Firminger produced a great effect upon those who heard him. Some, indeed, there were who had already made their way so far that they neither saw nor heard anything that followed, but fully 2/3 of the party checked their flight, and waited to see what would follow. They were much reassured by that which immediately occurred. James Firminger went up to the boy, and spoke to him kindly to the following effect: "Steenie boy, that's right. You aren't afraid of no witches nor crones neither, be you?" Thus addressed, Steenie drew himself up to his full height, smiled upon his questioner as he had upon his father, and said very gravely, "No, Steenie not 'fraid. Good people help Steenie." As this was immediately interpreted by all who heard him to mean that the half-witted lad was assured of supernatural assistance in any encounter which might ensue, it had a wonderfully comforting effect upon the whole party. The courage which, in the case of most of them, had been oozing out at their fingers' ends, suddenly and miraculously returned to its natural home in their hearts, and they began to encourage each other by speech and gesture, and to ask what there was to be afraid of. Seeing his opportunity, Firminger used all his arts of persuasion, and the result was that those of the party who had not got beyond hearing when the above mentioned incident took place, wheeled boldly and bodily round, and retraced their steps towards the knoll field, Firminger and Long leading the way, preceded by simple Steenie, who declined to walk with any of them, but trotted on ahead. As for Finn, he had disappeared and was no more seen that day, having been so completely overcome by the total failure of the great invocation to which he had pinned his faith, that he was incapable of further action for the time, and was indeed never quite the same man afterwards. When the party got near the gate, there was no sign of anything unusual, but as soon as they set foot within the field, the same roaring arose which they had heard before, and the same smoke began to puff out from the knoll and to enwrap it once more in dark wreaths. At this moment, Firminger, Long, and their followers suddenly started with surprise. Simple Steenie was indeed walking before them, having left the trotting pace at which he had started, but he was no longer alone. A short, thick-set man, clad entirely in grey from head to foot, was leading the boy by the hand as they advanced together. In his hand he held a long staff, but otherwise appeared to be entirely unarmed. Whence he had sprung from, no one could tell. They had not seen any of their own party rush forward, and certainly no one had descended from the knoll. However, there was the grey man, sure enough, and on he marched by Simple Steenie's side, as if they were the best friends in the world, and had long ago arranged the enterprise on which they were jointly bound. The others followed at a respectful distance, more and more astonished as matters went on. The roaring continued, and presently the same process was repeated as that which the people had previously witnessed and undergone. Figures moved rapidly amid the thick smoke, and ever and anon a lurid flame flashed from one side of the knoll to the other, affording a momentary glimpse of awful forms with threatening gestures directed towards those who appeared desirous to invade their territory. Still, Simple Steenie and his companion walked calmly on until they were within a very short distance of the knoll, when, as before, it opened, and a volume of cinders and ashes was again poured forth. But at the same instant the grey man raised his staff high above his head, and shook it in the air. Suddenly, without a cloud in the sky, or any appearance whatever of rain, a perfect torrent of water descended from the heavens upon the knoll, the effect of which was to produce just such a fizz as when you throw a tumbler of water upon the fire, only this sound was as if several 100,000 tumblers had been thrown upon the same number of fires all at once, producing the loudest and most wonderful fizz that you can imagine. At the same time, a prolonged and terrible howl arose from inside the hill, as if the effects of the water had caused great discomfort therein. Next happened a remarkable incident. The mouth of the knoll opened with the same kind of yawning action as has already been described, as if the same onslaught as before was about to be repeated. But instead of waiting for this, Steenie and the grey man both raised a loud shout. The latter brandished his staff once more over his head, and both of them rushed boldly forward into the mound, which immediately closed behind them. The bystanders were struck with horror and amazement. Was the grey man in league with the enemy, and had he thus lured poor Steenie to his destruction? If so, why and whence the torrent of water, which had evidently not been relished by the inhabitants of the knoll? What on earth did it all mean? For a few moments the whole party stood fearful and irresolute. Soon it became evident that warm work was going on inside the knoll. Shouts, yells, rumblings, howls, and the most discordant noises were heard from within, whilst there were those among the people, and notably James Firminger and Bully Robus, who always declared that they heard, in and above the outcry, the word "Dunstan! Dunstan!" repeated ever and anon, and the same thought crossed the minds of both of them at the same time, namely, that the appearance of the grey man greatly resembled the description of the great Saint Dunstan, so famous for the manner in which he tackled the arch enemy upon one occasion with a pair of tongs, and whose name was said to be especially dreaded by all evil creatures. Be this as it may, the noise had not continued above a minute or two, before the spirit of James Firminger became too much excited to allow of his remaining quiet any longer. Calling to his companions to come on and help poor Steenie, he rushed boldly forward, and was followed by most of the others. But they were still several yards away from the scene of action when they were stopped by an occurrence so extraordinary that no one who witnessed it ran the smallest chance of ever forgetting it. The knoll burst open in at least 20 different places, and from it there issued the same sort of creatures as those who had previously attacked and routed the Mercian forces. But their aspect was now as completely changed as their behaviour. Cowering, shrieking, huddling together as if to escape some terrible pursuer, they rushed frantically away on all sides with heart-rending cries of despair and anguish. Then, in the middle of the knoll, rushing after the retreating foe, appeared no less a personage than the Grey Man, flourishing his staff, and closely followed by Simple Steenie, whose features were glowing with excitement, and whom they distinctly saw in the act of administering a violent kick to a repulsive-looking creature with a serpent's head and a man's body, who was beyond all question an evil one of the worst description, but whose departure was much quickened by the action of the innocent. As everybody among the lookers-on was greatly confused and alarmed at the extraordinary spectacle suddenly presented to their view, one hardly knows how far it would be safe to rely upon the many different accounts which were afterwards given of the details of the transaction of which I am writing, and good Farmer Barrett always used to warn me against believing as gospel every particular of this part of the story. However, there were many worthy people out upon this day who declared solemnly that among the strange and horrible creatures who were turned out of Aldington Knoll that day, they recognized the faces and features of several of their neighbours, dead and gone, who had been reputed witches in their lifetimes, and little Dick Broadfoot, the tailor of Mersham Street, an acute man as well as an honest one, and one that would not willingly lie or exaggerate, always took his Bible oath that he saw, as plainly as he ever saw anything in his life, 3 awful creatures, with cats' heads and bodies, but with horns and wings, and with claws longer than any possessed by a mortal cat, fly out of the mount and down the woods, each having fast hold of and carrying with it a form which writhed and struggled as if in fearful agony, but writhed and struggled in vain. And furthermore, Dick avowed that he saw, though how he had had time to see it, I don't know. He saw, I say, and knew it for a certain fact, that these 3 unhappy wretches were the 3 crones of Mersham, doubtless being carried off to their own place by the 3 evil ones who had hitherto served them under the form of cats. Whether to believe the little tailor or not, I hardly know, but Bully Robus backed him up in the story, and as the 3 crones never again appeared in that part of the world, it may have been quite true. Certain it is that all those creatures who issued from the knoll in the way I have described were evidently driven out against their will, utterly defeated, and brought to tribulation by a superior power. In a very short time they had utterly disappeared, and a strong smell of sulphur being the only remaining token that they had ever been there, whilst upon the knoll, which was closed up behind them, Simple Steenie and his companion remained, standing alone in triumph. The people saw the Grey Man lay his hand upon the lad's head for an instant, as if calling down a blessing upon him. Then there came a mist or cloud over the knoll, and when they looked again, Steenie was standing alone. They hurried towards him, instinctively knowing that there was no more danger to be apprehended from the place, and he turned smilingly to meet them with an air of triumph. "Steenie not 'fraid," he said. "Naughty people run 'way, all gone." But to all their questions about his late companion, he would only answer by a vacant smile and incoherent words, which left them just as ignorant as before. They had, however, the great consolation of knowing that, whether it had come about by the aid of Simple Steenie's innocent efforts, or whether the Grey Man had of his own accord planned the whole affair, and arranged for the discomfiture of the wicked ones, that discomfiture was certain and complete. From that day forth, Aldington Knoll has been a peaceful, quiet spot, from whence the views to which I have already alluded may be contemplated without any fear of interference by any unpleasant inmates of the mound, for there are none worse than rabbits now. More might be told about some of the characters of our story, but short and casual allusions are not desirable, and to do more would be to lengthen the story too much. So I will leave my readers to fancy for themselves all that happened afterwards to John Gower and his family, as well as to Farmer Long, Simple Steenie, and all the rest of them. It is a good many years ago now since these things occurred, and the actors in the stirring scenes which I have related have long since passed away. If I had not chronicled them now, from my recollection of good old Farmer Barrett's gossips, I dare say Jack Barrett, who is a careless fellow at best, and not equal to his father young men seldom are in these days, according to my opinion, would have told the story differently, and only in fragments, to his children, and they would have varied it again in telling it to their children, so that in a couple of generations it would have been quite uncertain, and the real truth never would have been known. This is why I have thought it right to tell it. I drove down in my pony carriage the other day with a young lady by my side, to see the very spot where the crone's cottage used to stand, and to go through all the places where these scenes occurred. I could make them all out pretty clearly, though there is no vestige of the cottage left. We drove on to Bilsington and back towards Aldington by the same road that Mrs. Long and Tom the bailiff drove when they were taking the kitten back to the Gowers. We did not see any witches for certain, and perhaps there are none left, though, as it is a good way from the railroad, I am not very sure on this point. In a secluded spot by one of the woods, there was the figure of a man seated by the side of the road breaking stones, and I thought there was something in his look more than common. It was on a hill, up which I was walking, and if I had been alone I might have stopped and tried to find out more. But as I did not want to run the least chance of the young lady with me being frightened, I only took care to walk on the side of the road between the pony carriage and the figure, and as we passed it, I laid my right hand on my heart and pronounced that famous mystic word of power. Oh, I forgot. I must not write it, because that is forbidden. But if any little girl wants to know, boys are never curious, of course, so they won't mind not being told, she must just write me a pretty little letter and ask, and as I am very easily coaxed, I shall very likely either come and tell her, or make some arrangement by which she shall be able to find out for herself. It answered very well that day, as indeed it always does, and we got home quite safe. Home is the best place at which to leave one's friends, and therefore, having brought myself there in my writing, I think I will stop, and only hope that others beside myself will be interested in hearing the famous legend of the Crones of Mersham. End of chapter 6. Recorded by Allyson Hester. End of Uncle Joe's Stories by Edward KNATCHBULL-HUGESSON.